Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The bitter wind that swept across the Montana countryside on January 15, 1962, carried with it more than just the promise of another harsh winter storm. FBI agent Floyd Morrison pulled his coat tighter as he stepped out of his Bureau sedan and onto the frozen gravel driveway of the Whitmore family farmhouse. The snow crunched beneath his feet with that particular sound that only comes when the temperature drops well below freezing, and his breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. Floyd had been with the Bureau for 8 years, and in that time he'd handled missing persons cases that ranged from simple runaways to complex kidnapping operations. But something about this particular case had already set his nerves on edge, even before he'd driven the 200 miles from the field office in Helena to this remote corner of the state. Helen Patterson had been missing for 6 days. The 28-year-old schoolteacher had simply vanished without a trace from her small apartment above the general store in Pine Ridge, a town so small it barely qualified for a dot on most maps. The local sheriff had exhausted his limited resources and called in the Bureau when it became clear that this wasn't just another case of someone walking away from their problems. Floyd approached the farmhouse where Helen's father, Clarence Patterson, lived with his other daughter, Beatrice. The house was a 2-story structure that had seen better days, with peeling white paint and shutters that hung at odd angles. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, and warm yellow light glowed from the windows, offering the only signs of life in the desolate winter landscape. Before Floyd could knock, the front door swung open to reveal a tall, gaunt man in his early 60s. Clarence Patterson's face was weathered by decades of harsh Montana winters, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who hadn't slept properly in nearly a week. "You must be the FBI man," Clarence said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Sheriff called and said you were coming." "Agent Morrison," Floyd replied, extending his hand. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, Mr. Patterson." Clarence's handshake was firm but brief. "Come in out of the cold." Beatrice has coffee on. The interior of the farmhouse was spartanly furnished but clean. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of coffee mingled with the lingering aroma of breakfast bacon. Beatrice Patterson emerged from the kitchen, a woman in her early 30s with the same angular features as her father, but softer eyes that were red-rimmed from crying. "Any word?" she asked immediately, though Floyd could see in her expression that she already knew the answer. "Not yet, ma'am," Floyd said gently, "but I'm here to make sure we find her." Clarence gestured toward a worn sofa near the fireplace. "Sit down, Agent. I'll tell you everything I know, though it isn't much." Floyd settled into the offered seat and pulled out his notebook. "Why don't we start with when you last saw Helen?" "Sunday evening," Clarence said, taking a seat across from Floyd. "She came for dinner like she always does. Helen never misses Sunday dinner. Been that way since she moved to town 3 years ago to take the teaching job." "How did she seem that evening? Was anything bothering her?" Beatrice sat down beside her father. "She seemed fine. Normal. We talked about her students, about the cold snap coming in. Nothing unusual." "What time did she leave?" "Around 7, Clarence replied. "Said she had lessons to prepare for Monday." She walked back to town like always. Floyd made notes as he listened. Pine Ridge was small enough that Helen's apartment was only a 15-minute walk from the farm. Did anyone see her after that? That's where it gets strange, Clarence said, leaning forward. Mrs. Hutchins, who runs the general store, said she heard Helen come up the stairs to her apartment around 7:30. Heard her moving around up there for maybe an hour, then nothing. When did you realize something was wrong? Tuesday morning, Beatrice said. Helen didn't show up for school. That's not like her at all. She's never missed a day of work, not even when she had the flu last winter. Floyd nodded. What did you do then? I went to check on her, Clarence continued. Mrs. Hutchins let me up to the apartment. The door was unlocked, which was odd. Helen always locks her door, but the strange thing was, everything looked normal. Her bed was made, her clothes were still in the closet, her purse was on the kitchen table. No signs of a struggle? None at all. It was like she'd just stepped out for a few minutes, except she never came back. Floyd felt that familiar itch between his shoulder blades that always came when a case didn't add up. Did Helen have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt her? Enemies? Clarence's voice rose slightly. Helen's a schoolteacher in a town of 200 people. Everybody loves her. She's been nothing but good to this community. What about a boyfriend? Someone she might have been seeing? Beatrice and Clarence exchanged a look that didn't go unnoticed by Floyd. Well, Beatrice said slowly, there was something she mentioned a few weeks ago. A man who'd been coming by the school. What kind of man? She said he claimed to be from the state education department. Said he was evaluating rural schools for possible consolidation. Helen thought it was strange because no one from the county office knew anything about it. Floyd's pen stopped moving. Did she describe this man? Tall, well-dressed, drove a black sedan. He came by 3 or 4 times, always asking questions about the school, about Helen's teaching methods, about the children. Did Helen report this to anyone? She mentioned it to Sheriff Burke, but he said state bureaucrats come through all the time. Told her not to worry about it. Floyd made several notes, underlining certain phrases. This man, did he ever approach Helen outside of school? Not that she mentioned, Clarence said. But the last time he came by was about a week before she disappeared. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Floyd could see the weight of Helen's absence pressing down on her family like a physical thing. He'd seen it before in other cases, the way hope and fear warred in the faces of those left behind. Mr. Patterson, Floyd said carefully, I need to ask you about Helen's personal life. Was she seeing anyone romantically? Clarence's jaw tightened. Helen keeps to herself mostly. There was a young man in town, the banker's son, who'd been calling on her, but nothing serious. Anyone else? Maybe someone from out of town? Another exchange of glances between father and daughter. There might have been someone, Beatrice said reluctantly. Helen mentioned getting letters. She seemed happy about them, but secretive too. Letters from whom? She never said. But I saw her reading one a few weeks ago, and she got this look on her face, like she was pleased but nervous at the same time. Floyd felt his pulse quicken. Do you know if she kept these letters? I don't know. We haven't been through her things thoroughly. Sheriff Burke said not to disturb anything until you arrived. That's good, Floyd said, standing. I'd like to examine her apartment now, if that's possible. Clarence rose as well. I'll drive you into town. Mrs. Hutchins will let us up. As they prepared to leave, Floyd couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Helen Patterson's disappearance than a simple missing person case. The mysterious man from the education department, the secret letters, the unlocked door. Each detail seemed to point toward something darker than a young woman simply walking away from her life. The wind had picked up by the time they stepped outside, and snow was beginning to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Winter in Montana could be brutal and unforgiving, and Floyd knew that if Helen was out there somewhere, time was running out fast. As Clarence started his truck and Floyd climbed into the passenger seat, he found himself wondering if they were looking for a missing person or something much worse. The town of Pine Ridge lay ahead of them through the swirling snow, and with it, the apartment that might hold the key to Helen Patterson's fate. The truck's engine coughed to life, and they began the short journey into town. Floyd stared out at the white landscape stretching endlessly in all directions, and tried not to think about how easy it would be for someone to disappear forever in country like this. But as they drove through the gathering storm, Floyd couldn't escape the growing certainty that Helen Patterson hadn't simply vanished into the Montana wilderness. Someone had taken her, and whoever it was had been planning it for a long time. The general store in Pine Ridge occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building that looked like it had been standing since the town's founding in the 1890s. Mrs. Hutchins, a stout woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, met Floyd and Clarence at the front door. Her hands shook slightly as she turned the key in the lock, and Floyd noticed the deep worry lines etched around her eyes. "I've been over this 100 times in my mind," she said as they climbed the narrow wooden stairs to Helen's apartment. "Trying to remember if I heard anything unusual that night. But there was nothing at all." The stairs creaked under their weight, and Floyd found himself listening carefully to the sounds the old building made. If someone had forced their way up here, Mrs. Hutchins would have heard it. The walls were thin, and every footstep echoed through the structure. "These are the only stairs?" Floyd asked. "Only way up or down," Mrs. Hutchins confirmed. Helen liked it that way, said it made her feel safe, knowing that no one could sneak up on her. They reached the top of the stairs and Mrs. Hutchins produced another key. "I've got the only spare. Helen gave it to me when she moved in, just in case of emergencies." The apartment door swung open to reveal a modest but comfortable living space. Floyd stepped inside and immediately began cataloging details. The apartment consisted of 4 rooms: a small living area with a kitchenette, a bedroom, a bathroom, and what appeared to be a study where Helen graded papers and prepared lessons. Everything was exactly as Clarence had described it: neat, orderly, with no signs of disturbance. Helen's purse sat on the kitchen table, her keys beside it. A half-empty cup of coffee sat next to a stack of graded arithmetic papers, as if she'd been interrupted in the middle of her evening routine. Floyd moved through the space methodically, his trained eye searching for anything that might provide a clue to Helen's disappearance. In the bedroom, he found her clothes hanging neatly in the closet, her bed made with military precision. On the nightstand sat a small alarm clock, a glass of water, and a well-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. "Helen loves to read," Beatrice said softly from the doorway. "Always has a book with her." Floyd opened the nightstand drawer and found exactly what he was looking for. Hidden beneath a stack of handkerchiefs were 7 letters, each in the same masculine handwriting, each postmarked from Billings, Montana. "Clarence," Floyd called, "come look at this." The older man approached as Floyd carefully lifted out the letters. "You think these might be important?" "Everything's important until we know it isn't," Floyd replied, examining the postmarks. The letters spanned a period of 6 weeks, with the most recent one dated just 4 days before Helen's disappearance. Floyd opened the most recent letter carefully, aware that he might be violating Helen's privacy, but knowing that her life could depend on what these letters contained. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grim. "What is it?" Clarence asked. "This letter is from someone named David," Floyd said slowly. "He's apparently been corresponding with Helen for several weeks. Listen to this. My dearest Helen, I cannot wait much longer to meet you in person. The photographs you sent only make my desire to see you stronger. I have made arrangements for us to be together, and soon you will understand the depth of my feelings for you." Beatrice gasped. Helen never mentioned anyone named David. Floyd continued reading. The letter goes on to say that he's been watching her from afar, that he knows her routines, her habits. He mentions seeing her at the school, knowing when she visits her family. Floyd looked up at Clarence. This isn't a normal courtship. This is stalking behavior. You think this David person took her? Clarence's voice was tight with controlled anger. It's possible. But there's something else here that bothers me. Floyd flipped through the other letters quickly. The handwriting changes slightly between the early letters and the recent ones. And look at this. He showed them a passage from one of the middle letters. Here, he mentions details about Helen's life that only someone very close to her would know. Her favorite meal, the fact that she hums while she grades papers, even the name of her childhood dog. How could a stranger know those things? Beatrice asked. Either he's been watching her much more closely than we thought, or... Floyd paused, a disturbing possibility forming in his mind. Or he's getting information from someone who knows Helen well. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the small apartment. Floyd continued his search, moving to Helen's study. Here, he found more evidence of her orderly nature. Lesson plans were neatly filed, student records organized by date, and a gradebook that was meticulously maintained. But on the desk, partially hidden under a stack of ungraded papers, Floyd found something that made his blood run cold. It was a photograph of Helen, clearly taken without her knowledge. She was walking from the school to her apartment, her face in profile, completely unaware that she was being photographed. "Dear God," Clarence whispered when Floyd showed him the picture. "Someone's been stalking her." Floyd turned the photograph over and found a handwritten note in the same script as the letters. "Soon, my darling. Very soon." The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted Floyd's examination. Mrs. Hutchins called up. "Sheriff Burke is here. Says he needs to speak with the FBI man." Sheriff Burke proved to be a heavyset man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He climbed the stairs with obvious effort, breathing heavily by the time he reached the apartment. "Agent Morrison?" Burke extended a meaty hand. "Heard you were here. Wanted to fill you in on what we've found so far." "What have you got, Sheriff?" "Well, we've been asking around town, and it turns out several people saw that black sedan you were asking about. Mrs. Carter at the post office says she saw it parked outside the school at least 4 times in the past month. Always during school hours." Floyd made notes. "Anyone get a look at the license plate?" "That's the thing. Tommy Martinez down at the gas station says the car came through for fuel about 2 weeks ago. Driver paid cash, kept his hat pulled low, but Tommy got a partial on the plate. Montana tags started with GX. That's helpful. What else?" "Here's where it gets interesting," Burke continued. "I called the state education department like you suggested. They don't have anyone doing rural school evaluations. Haven't sent anyone out to Pine Ridge in over 2 years." Floyd felt pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. So, our mystery man was lying about his reason for being here. Gets worse. I also checked with the Postal Service. Turns out those letters you found, they weren't mailed from Billings like the postmarks say. The postal inspector says they were processed through our local route, then re-postmarked to make it look like they came from somewhere else. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Helen's stalker wasn't some distant admirer from Billings. He was local, or at least operating locally. "Sheriff," Floyd said carefully, "I need you to think about this. Who in this area would have access to detailed information about Helen's personal life? Who would know her well enough to write the kinds of things I found in these letters?" Burke scratched his chin. "Well, there's her family, of course. Her fellow teachers. Maybe some of the parents of her students. The banker's son who's been courting her. What's the banker's son's name? Thomas Fairchild. Nice young man, works at his father's bank. Been sweet on Helen for about a year now." Floyd made a note to interview Thomas Fairchild, but something told him the answer lay elsewhere. The letters showed a level of obsession that went beyond normal romantic interest. This was someone who had been planning Helen's disappearance for weeks, possibly months. As they prepared to leave the apartment, Floyd took one last look around. Something had been nagging at him since he'd arrived, a sense that he was missing something important. Then it hit him. "Mrs. Hutchins," he called as they descended the stairs. "You said you heard Helen moving around in her apartment on Sunday night. What exactly did you hear?" The older woman thought for a moment. Normal sounds at first. Her heels on the floor, water running in the bathroom, that sort of thing. But now that you mention it, I did hear something odd around 8:30 or so. What kind of odd? It sounded like she was moving furniture. Heavy, dragging sounds, like she was rearranging her bedroom. I thought it was strange because Helen never moves things around. She likes everything in its place. Floyd exchanged glances with Clarence. How long did these sounds last? Maybe 20 minutes, then everything went quiet. I remember thinking she must have gone to bed early. But Floyd was already forming a different theory. The dragging sounds, the unlocked door, the lack of any signs of struggle. Someone had been in that apartment with Helen on Sunday night, and whatever had happened had required moving something heavy. As they stood in the general store, Floyd made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. "Sheriff Burke, I need you to contact the state crime lab immediately. We need to process Helen's apartment as a crime scene. You think something happened to her up there? I think someone took her from that apartment on Sunday night, and they went to great lengths to make it look like she left voluntarily." Floyd looked out at the snow that was now falling heavily. "And I think they had help from someone Helen trusted." The words hung in the air like an accusation. In a town as small as Pine Ridge, the idea that someone Helen knew and trusted could be involved in her disappearance was almost too horrible to contemplate. But Floyd had learned long ago that the most dangerous predators were often the ones who smiled at you across the dinner table, who knew your habits and your fears, who could get close enough to strike without warning. Somewhere out there in the Montana wilderness, Helen Patterson was either fighting for her life or already beyond help. And Floyd was beginning to suspect that her captor was someone who had been planning this for a very long time. Someone who knew exactly how to make a young woman disappear without a trace. The storm outside was getting worse, and time was running out. By Wednesday morning, the storm had deposited nearly 2 feet of snow across the Pine Ridge area, effectively cutting off the small town from the outside world. Floyd had spent the night at the local boarding house, a drafty 2-story building that catered to traveling salesmen and the occasional government official. He'd barely slept, his mind churning over the evidence they'd collected from Helen's apartment. The crime scene technicians from the state lab had arrived just before the worst of the storm hit, and their preliminary findings had confirmed Floyd's worst fears. Luminol testing had revealed traces of blood in Helen's bedroom. Blood that had been carefully cleaned, but not completely eliminated. The pattern suggested that something violent had occurred near the window, and that someone had gone to considerable effort to conceal it. More disturbing still was the discovery of chloroform residue on Helen's pillow. Someone had drugged her in her own bed, then removed her from the apartment while she was unconscious. The heavy dragging sounds Mrs. Hutchins had heard weren't furniture being moved. They were the sounds of Helen's limp body being carried down the stairs. Floyd sat in the boarding house's small dining room, nursing his third cup of coffee and studying the case file he'd assembled. The letters from David were spread out before him, and he'd been analyzing them for hours, looking for any clue that might reveal the writer's true identity. What troubled him most was the intimate knowledge the letter writer displayed about Helen's personal life. Details that only someone very close to her could know. The way she hummed when she was content, her habit of grading papers while eating breakfast, even the fact that she kept a photograph of her deceased mother in her jewelry box. A knock on the dining room door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Kowalski, the boarding house proprietor, peered in with a worried expression. "Agent Morrison, Sheriff Burke is here to see you. Says it's urgent." Floyd gathered up the letters and followed Mrs. Kowalski to the front parlor, where Sheriff Burke was stamping snow off his boots. The sheriff's face was grim, and Floyd could see that he'd been up all night as well. "We've got a problem," Burke said without preamble. "A big one." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that makes this case a whole lot more complicated. I spent the night going through our files, looking for anything that might connect to Helen's disappearance. Found something from last winter that we should have caught earlier." Burke pulled out a manila folder and spread its contents on the small table between them. "Remember, I mentioned that Helen never missed work? Well, that wasn't entirely true. She missed 3 days last February, called in sick with the flu. So, I talked to Dr. Patterson, no relation to Helen's family, who treats most folks in town. He never saw Helen during those 3 days. Never prescribed any medicine for her. As far as he knows, she wasn't sick at all." Floyd felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What else did you find?" "This." Burke handed him a police report dated February 18th of the previous year. Mrs. Henderson, who lives about 5 miles out of town, reported seeing a woman walking along the county road in the middle of a snowstorm. Said the woman looked confused, like she didn't know where she was. Floyd read the report quickly. "Did anyone investigate?" Deputy Miller drove out to look, but by the time he got there, whoever it was had disappeared. "We figured it was just someone whose car had broken down and they'd gotten a ride." "But you think it might have been Helen?" "I do now." Mrs. Henderson's description matches Helen perfectly. And here's the kicker. The woman was wearing a nightgown under a heavy coat, like she'd been grabbed from her bed. The implications were staggering. If Burke was right, then Helen's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. Someone had taken her before, possibly held her for 3 days, then returned her with no memory of what had happened. "There's more," Burke continued. "I called around to some of the other counties, asked if they'd had any similar cases. Turns out Glacier County had a woman go missing for 4 days last spring. When she turned up, she had no memory of where she'd been. Claimed she'd been sick with the flu, but there was no medical record of treatment." Floyd stood up abruptly, his mind racing. "How many other cases?" "At least 3 that I've found so far. All young women, all teachers or nurses, all disappeared for a few days, then returned with no memory of what happened to them." "And Helen?" "Helen might have been taken before and returned. But this time, something went wrong. Maybe she started to remember what happened to her. Maybe she threatened to go to the police. Floyd walked to the window and stared out at the snow-covered street. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than he'd imagined. They weren't dealing with a simple kidnapping. They were dealing with a serial predator who had been operating in rural Montana for at least a year, possibly longer. Sheriff, I need you to contact every law enforcement agency within 200 miles of here. We need to find out how many other cases like this there have been, and we need to do it fast. Already started making calls, but Agent Morrison, there's something else you need to know. Burke's tone had changed, becoming even more serious than before. Floyd turned from the window, sensing that whatever the sheriff was about to tell him would change everything. I talked to Beatrice Patterson again this morning. Asked her some more detailed questions about Helen's behavior in the weeks before she disappeared. Turns out Helen had been acting strange for quite a while. Strange how? Forgetful. She'd forget conversations they'd had, forget plans they'd made. Beatrice thought it was just stress from work, but now, Burke trailed off. Now you think someone was drugging her regularly. That's exactly what I think. Small doses of chloroform or something similar. Enough to cause memory loss, but not enough to be obvious. Someone's been experimenting on these women, Agent Morrison, and Helen figured it out. Floyd felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The letters from David took on a new, more sinister meaning. They weren't love letters at all. They were the writings of a predator who had been documenting his experiments with his victims. "We need to find Thomas Fairchild," Floyd said suddenly. "The banker's son. He's been courting Helen, which means he'd have access to her apartment. He'd know her routines, her habits. Already thought of that. Went by the bank first thing this morning. Thomas left town on Monday, the day after Helen disappeared. His father says he went to visit relatives in Great Falls, but I called the relatives. They haven't seen him." Floyd grabbed his coat. "We need to search his house. Now. Can't. Not without a warrant, and Judge Morrison won't issue one based on what we've got so far. Then we need more evidence." "What about the car?" "The black sedan with Montana plates starting with GX. Working on it. DMV records show 17 vehicles in this area, with plates starting GX. I've got deputies checking on all of them." Floyd was about to respond when the sound of a car engine outside caught his attention. Through the snow, he could see a black sedan pulling up in front of the boarding house. His hand instinctively moved to the gun under his coat. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "is that one of your deputies?" Burke looked out the window and his face went pale. "No, and that car matches the description we've been looking for." The car sat idling in the street for several long minutes. Floyd couldn't see the driver clearly through the falling snow, but he had the distinct impression that whoever was behind the wheel was watching the boarding house intently. "Get on the radio," Floyd whispered. "Call for backup." But before Burke could move, the car's engine revved and it began moving slowly down the street. Floyd ran for the door, pulling on his coat as he went. By the time he reached the sidewalk, the sedan was already disappearing around the corner. Floyd ran to his own car, but the engine was cold and took precious seconds to start. By the time he reached the corner where the sedan had turned, it was gone. The snow was falling too heavily to see tracks, and there were several directions the car could have gone. Frustrated, Floyd drove slowly through the town's few streets, but there was no sign of the black sedan. Whoever had been watching the boarding house had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. When Floyd returned to the boarding house, he found Burke on the radio with his dispatcher. The sheriff's face was tense as he listened to the voice crackling through the static. "What is it?" Floyd asked as Burke signed off. "That was Deputy Miller. He's out at the Henderson place and he found something. Tire tracks in the snow leading to an old hunting cabin about 3 miles from where Mrs. Henderson saw that woman walking last year. Fresh tracks? Made sometime in the last 24 hours. And Agent Morrison? Miller says there's smoke coming from the cabin's chimney. Floyd felt his pulse quicken. After 6 days of searching, they might finally have found where Helen was being held. But as they prepared to head out to the cabin, Floyd couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The person who had taken Helen was smart, methodical, and had been planning this for a long time. The fact that he'd shown up outside the boarding house suggested that he knew the FBI was getting close. And in Floyd's experience, cornered predators were the most dangerous kind. As they loaded their weapons and prepared to venture out into the storm, Floyd found himself wondering if they would find Helen alive, or if they were already too late. The clock was ticking, and somewhere out there in the Montana wilderness, a monster was waiting for them. The drive to the Henderson place was treacherous, with the snow continuing to fall and the wind picking up. Floyd's sedan struggled through the drifts, and more than once he thought they might get stuck. But Burke knew the back roads like the back of his hand, and he guided them through a series of turns that eventually brought them to a small farmhouse nestled in a grove of pine trees. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door, a worried-looking woman in her 70s who'd clearly been watching for their arrival. "Thank goodness you're here," she said, ushering them inside. "I've been worried sick since I called this in." "Tell us about the cabin, Mrs. Henderson," Floyd said, accepting the cup of hot coffee she pressed into his hands. "It belongs to the Morrison family. No relation to you, Agent Morrison. They only use it during hunting season, but I saw smoke coming from the chimney yesterday evening. Thought it was strange, with the weather being so bad." "How far is it from here?" "About 3 miles through the woods. There's an old logging road that leads most of the way there, but you'll have to walk the last half mile or so." Floyd studied the map Mrs. Henderson provided, noting the cabin's isolated location. It was perfect for someone who wanted to keep prisoners without being discovered. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Henderson herself, and she was too far away to hear anything that might happen at the cabin. "Mrs. Henderson," Floyd said carefully, "I need you to think back to last February when you saw that woman on the road. Did you notice anything else unusual around that time? Any strangers in the area? Any vehicles you didn't recognize?" The old woman thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, there was something. About a week before I saw that poor woman, I noticed someone had been using the logging road. Fresh tire tracks in the snow. I thought maybe it was hunters, even though it wasn't season." "Did you see the vehicle?" "Once. It was a black car of some kind. Drove past here real slow one evening, like the driver was looking for something." Floyd and Burke exchanged glances. The black sedan had been in the area during Helen's previous disappearance as well. The pattern was becoming clear. "We need to get to that cabin," Floyd said, standing up. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to stay inside and keep your doors locked. If you see or hear anything unusual, get on the phone immediately." The old woman nodded, her face pale with worry. "You think that poor girl is up there?" "I don't know," Floyd replied honestly, "but we're going to find out." The walk to the cabin was grueling. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind cut through their heavy coats like a knife. Burke led the way, following a path that was barely visible under the snow. Floyd kept his gun drawn, his eyes constantly scanning the woods around them for any sign of movement. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached a ridge that overlooked a small clearing. Below them, nestled among the pine trees, was a rustic log cabin with smoke rising from its stone chimney. A black sedan was parked beside the cabin, nearly buried in snow. "That's our car," Burke whispered, raising his binoculars. "Montana plates, starting with GX." Floyd studied the cabin through his own binoculars. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, making it impossible to see inside. But the smoke from the chimney and the recently used car suggested that someone was definitely inside. "How do you want to play this?" Burke asked. Floyd considered their options. The cabin had only one visible door, and the windows were too high off the ground to serve as easy escape routes. But if Helen was inside, they had to be careful not to put her in more danger. "We'll approach from two sides," Floyd decided. "You go around to the back, make sure no one can escape that way. Give me 10 minutes, then I'll approach the front door." Burke nodded and began making his way carefully around the perimeter of the clearing. Floyd waited, counting off the minutes and trying to calm his racing heart. This was the moment they'd been building toward, and he knew that what happened in the next few minutes would determine whether Helen Patterson lived or died. When his watch showed that 10 minutes had passed, Floyd began his approach to the cabin. He moved slowly and quietly, using the trees for cover as much as possible. The snow muffled his footsteps, but it also made movement difficult and unpredictable. He was 50 yards from the cabin when he heard it. A woman's scream, muffled but unmistakably filled with terror. Helen was alive, but she was in immediate danger. Floyd abandoned stealth and ran toward the cabin, his boots slipping in the snow. As he reached the front door, he could hear voices inside. A man's voice, calm and controlled, and a woman's voice begging for mercy. Without hesitation, Floyd kicked in the door. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The scene inside the cabin was worse than anything Floyd had prepared himself for. Helen Patterson sat bound to a wooden chair in the center of the main room, her wrists raw from struggling against rope restraints. Her face was gaunt and pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she was alive. What made Floyd's blood run cold wasn't just Helen's condition. It was the man standing beside her, calmly adjusting a primitive camera mounted on a tripod. Thomas Fairchild looked up as Floyd burst through the door, and his expression showed no surprise whatsoever. In fact, he smiled, as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. "Agent Morrison," Thomas said pleasantly, his voice carrying the same tone one might use when greeting an old friend. "Right on time. I was just documenting Helen's progress." Floyd kept his gun trained on Thomas, while his eyes quickly scanned the cabin's interior. What he saw made his stomach turn. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, showing women in various states of distress. Some Floyd recognized as the missing persons cases Burke had mentioned. Others were strangers, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and confusion. "Let her go, Thomas," Floyd said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's over." Thomas laughed, a sound that was somehow more chilling than a scream. "Over? Agent Morrison, you have no idea what you've stumbled into. This isn't ending. It's just beginning." Helen tried to speak, but Floyd could see that she'd been gagged. Her eyes pleaded with him, and he could see fresh bruises on her arms and face. Whatever Thomas had been doing to her over the past 6 days, it had been systematic and brutal. "You see," Thomas continued, moving away from the camera and toward a wooden table covered with what appeared to be medical instruments, "Helen has been helping me with some very important research. Haven't you, my dear?" He reached over and stroked Helen's hair with a gentleness that was obscene, given the circumstances. Helen flinched away from his touch, her whole body trembling. "What kind of research?" Floyd asked, trying to keep Thomas talking while he looked for an opportunity to get closer. "Memory," Thomas said. his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. Specifically, how to erase it selectively. You see, I've discovered that with the right combination of chemicals and psychological pressure, I can make a person forget entire periods of their life. It's fascinating work. Floyd felt sick. The other women. You've been experimenting on them. Oh, yes, Helen isn't my first subject, and she won't be my last. Though I must admit she's been my most challenging case. Most of the others accepted their memory loss quite readily after I returned them to their normal lives. But Helen... Thomas shook his head with what appeared to be genuine disappointment. Helen started remembering things she shouldn't remember. That's why you took her permanently this time? I had no choice. She was going to ruin everything. Do you know how long I've been perfecting this technique? 2 years, Agent Morrison? 2 years of careful experimentation, and Helen was going to destroy it all because she couldn't accept what had happened to her. Floyd glanced toward the back of the cabin, wondering where Burke was. The plan had been for the sheriff to cover the rear exit, but Floyd hadn't heard anything from him since entering the cabin. "Where's Sheriff Burke, Thomas?" The young man's smile widened. "Oh, I'm afraid the good sheriff won't be joining us. You see, I've been planning for this day for quite some time. I knew eventually someone would figure out what I was doing, and I wanted to be prepared." A chill ran down Floyd's spine. "What did you do to him?" "The same thing I'm going to do to you, Agent Morrison. And then I'm going to take Helen somewhere far away, where we can continue our work without interruption." Thomas moved suddenly, faster than Floyd had expected. The young man grabbed a bottle from the table and threw it directly at Floyd's face. Floyd ducked, but the motion threw off his aim as he fired his weapon. The bullet splintered wood from the cabin wall, and Thomas used the distraction to dive behind an overturned table. "You can't stop what's already in motion," Thomas shouted from his hiding place. "I have colleagues, Agent Morrison. Other researchers who understand the importance of this work. Kill me, and 10 more will take my place." Floyd moved cautiously toward Helen, keeping his gun pointed in Thomas's direction. As he got closer, he could see that she was trying to tell him something with her eyes, looking repeatedly toward the back door of the cabin. "Burke!" Floyd called out, hoping the sheriff was still alive and in position. There was no response. "He can't hear you," Thomas said, and Floyd could hear him moving around behind the table. "I'm afraid the sheriff had an unfortunate accident in the woods." Amazing how easy it is for someone to get lost in a snowstorm. Floyd reached Helen and began working on her restraints with one hand, while keeping his gun ready with the other. The ropes were tied with complex knots, and it was taking too long. "You know what the beautiful thing about my research is?" Thomas continued, his voice coming from a different location now. He was moving, and Floyd couldn't pinpoint his exact position. "Even if you manage to stop me today, you'll never find all the women I've experimented on. Some of them don't even know what happened to them. They're walking around right now, living normal lives, completely unaware that entire weeks have been stolen from their memories." Floyd finally got one of Helen's hands free, and she immediately began working on the gag covering her mouth. When she pulled it away, her first words were barely a whisper. "There are others here," she said urgently, "in the basement. He's been keeping them down there." The revelation hit Floyd like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Helen. There were other victims currently being held in this cabin. "How many?" Floyd asked as he worked on her other restraint. 3, maybe 4. I heard them crying at night." A sound from the basement confirmed Helen's words. A faint tapping, like someone trying to signal for help through the floorboards. "You hear that, Agent Morrison?" Thomas called out, and Floyd could hear genuine pleasure in his voice. "My other subjects are eager to meet you." Would you like to see them? They're in various stages of the treatment process. Floyd felt a rage building inside him unlike anything he'd experienced in his 8 years with the Bureau. The casual way Thomas discussed his victims, as if they were laboratory animals, made Floyd want to abandon protocol and put a bullet in the man's head. But he forced himself to stay professional. Helen was free now, but she was too weak to run. The other victims were trapped in the basement, and Burke was somewhere outside, possibly dead. "Helen," Floyd whispered, "can you walk?" She nodded, though Floyd could see that she was barely able to stand. 6 days of captivity and whatever Thomas had done to her had left her severely weakened. A crash from the back of the cabin made Floyd spin around, his gun raised, but instead of Thomas, he saw Sheriff Burke stumbling through the rear door, blood streaming from a head wound. "Behind you," Burke shouted, raising his own weapon. Floyd turned just in time to see Thomas emerging from behind the overturned table, not with a gun, but with a strange-looking device that resembled a perfume atomizer. Before Floyd could react, Thomas squeezed the device, and a fine mist sprayed across the cabin. The effect was almost immediate. Floyd felt his vision blur, and his limbs became heavy and unresponsive. The gun fell from his hand as he collapsed to his knees, struggling to breathe. "Chloroform vapor," Thomas said conversationally as Floyd fought to stay conscious. "A little innovation of my own. Much more efficient than the old rag-over-the-mouth method." Floyd could see Burke collapsing as well, the sheriff's gun clattering across the wooden floor. Helen, already weakened, had fallen unconscious almost immediately. "Now then," Thomas continued, moving around the cabin with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before, "we can have a proper conversation." Floyd tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick and unresponsive. The world was spinning, and he could feel consciousness slipping away despite his efforts to fight it. "Don't struggle, Agent Morrison. The chemical will wear off in a few hours, and when you wake up, you'll be in a much better position to appreciate the scope of my work." As Floyd's vision darkened, he could hear Thomas moving around the cabin, apparently preparing for whatever came next. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was Thomas kneeling beside Helen, checking her pulse with the clinical detachment of a doctor examining a patient. When Floyd awoke, the first thing he noticed was the smell. It was a mixture of chemical disinfectant and something else, something organic and unpleasant that he didn't want to identify. The second thing he noticed was that he was no longer in the main room of the cabin. He was underground. Floyd found himself in what appeared to be a finished basement, though finished was perhaps too generous a term. The walls were concrete, and bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling provided harsh, unforgiving light. But what dominated the space were the cells. 6 small rooms had been constructed along one wall, each with heavy wooden doors and small barred windows. Through the windows, Floyd could see movement, and he realized, with horror, that Thomas hadn't been lying about having other victims. "Ah, Agent Morrison, you're awake." Floyd turned to see Thomas descending a wooden staircase, carrying a clipboard and wearing what appeared to be a doctor's white coat. The transformation from the pleasant young banker to this clinical figure was disturbing in its completeness. "Where are Burke and Helen?" Floyd demanded, though his voice came out as more of a croak. "Safe for now, though their safety depends entirely on your cooperation." Floyd looked around the basement more carefully. He was restrained to a metal chair with leather straps, similar to what might be found in a hospital. To his left was a table covered with medical instruments, bottles of various chemicals, and what appeared to be a detailed notebook. "You see, Agent Morrison, you've presented me with an interesting opportunity. I've never had the chance to work with a federal agent before. I'm curious to see how your mind responds to the treatment process. You're insane if you think the Bureau won't come looking for me." Thomas laughed. "Oh, they'll look. But they'll be looking for an agent who was killed in a snowstorm while pursuing a dangerous fugitive. Your car will be found at the bottom of a ravine, your body nowhere to be seen. Very tragic, but these things happen in Montana winters." Floyd tested his restraints, but they were secure. Thomas had clearly done this before. "The women in those cells," Floyd said. "How long have you been holding them?" "It varies. Some are recent acquisitions. Others have been with me for months. The process takes time, you see. Each mind is different, and I have to customize the treatment accordingly." Thomas moved to the table and picked up his notebook, flipping through pages covered with detailed handwriting. "Take Subject 7, for instance," he said, gesturing toward one of the cells. "A nurse from Kalispell. She's been here for 6 weeks, and I've successfully erased 3 years of her memories. When I return her to her normal life, she'll believe she's been on an extended vacation. Her friends and family will simply be told that she needed time to recover from a nervous breakdown. They'll know something's wrong. People don't just disappear for months. You'd be surprised how accepting people can be when given a plausible explanation, especially when that explanation comes from someone they trust." Thomas smiled. "I am, after all, a respected member of several communities. A banker, a church member, a volunteer with various charitable organizations. Who would suspect me of anything improper?" Floyd felt a growing sense of despair as he began to understand the true scope of what Thomas had been doing. This wasn't just about Helen or even about the handful of women currently imprisoned in this basement. This was a systematic operation that had been going on for years, with Thomas using his position in the community to select victims and cover his tracks. "How many?" Floyd asked. "How many what? How many women have you done this to?" Thomas consulted his notebook. 37 completed subjects over the past 2 years. Though I should mention that not all of them survived the process. The early experiments were rather crude, and I'm afraid I lost several subjects to chemical poisoning. The casual way Thomas discussed the deaths of his victims made Floyd's blood boil. He strained against his restraints, but Thomas was staying well out of reach. "The beauty of the system," Thomas continued, "is that even the failed experiments are easy to explain. A hiking accident here, a car crash there. Rural Montana can be dangerous, especially for young women traveling alone." A sound from upstairs interrupted their conversation, the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the cabin's wooden floor. Thomas frowned. "That's odd. I wasn't expecting visitors." Floyd felt a surge of hope. Maybe Burke had escaped. Maybe backup had arrived. But Thomas seemed more annoyed than worried. "Excuse me for a moment, Agent Morrison. I need to deal with this interruption." Thomas climbed the stairs, and Floyd heard the basement door close and lock behind him. Left alone, Floyd began working frantically on his restraints, trying to find any weakness in the leather straps. From the cells around him, he could hear whispered voices. The other prisoners had realized he was awake. "Help us," came a weak voice from the nearest cell. "Please, we've been here so long." "I'm FBI," Floyd called back as quietly as he could. "I'm going to get you out of here." But even as he said the words, Floyd wasn't sure how he could keep that promise. Thomas had been planning this for years, and he seemed to have contingencies for every possibility. The sound of gunshots from upstairs made Floyd freeze. 2 quick shots, then silence. A few minutes later, Thomas returned, but he wasn't alone. He was dragging Sheriff Burke's unconscious form down the stairs. "I'm afraid your colleague was more resourceful than I gave him credit for," Thomas said. apparently unbothered by whatever had happened upstairs. He managed to free himself and was trying to radio for backup. I couldn't allow that. Thomas dumped Burke's body on the concrete floor, and Floyd could see that the sheriff was breathing but bleeding from a fresh wound on his shoulder. Is he alive? For now. But his usefulness has ended. Thomas picked up a syringe from the medical table. I think it's time to begin your treatment, Agent Morrison. Don't worry. You won't remember any of this unpleasantness. Floyd watched in horror as Thomas prepared the injection. Whatever was in that syringe would begin the process of destroying his mind, turning him into another empty shell like the women in the cells around him. But as Thomas approached, syringe in hand, Floyd noticed something the other man had missed. In dragging Burke down the stairs, Thomas had left the basement door slightly ajar, and through that gap, Floyd could see movement on the staircase. Helen had somehow managed to free herself. Floyd forced himself to remain calm as Thomas approached, not wanting to alert him to Helen's presence. The young woman was moving slowly, obviously still weakened by her ordeal, but she was carrying something in her hand. "This may sting a bit," Thomas said, raising the syringe. "But don't worry. In a few hours you won't remember the pain." Helen struck at that moment, bringing what Floyd now recognized as a heavy wrench down on the back of Thomas's head. The blow sent him stumbling forward, and the syringe flew from his hand to shatter against the concrete wall. But Thomas wasn't finished. He spun around and grabbed Helen by the throat, his face twisted with rage. "You stupid girl! Do you have any idea what you've done?" Helen struggled in his grip, but she was too weak to fight effectively. Floyd strained against his restraints with renewed desperation, the leather cutting into his wrists as he tried to break free. "You were going to be perfect," Thomas snarled at Helen. "A clean slate, ready to be programmed with whatever memories I chose to give you. But you had to fight it. You had to remember." Thomas's hands tightened around Helen's throat, and Floyd could see her face beginning to turn blue. In seconds, she would be dead. That's when Sheriff Burke proved that he was tougher than he looked. Despite his injuries, Burke had managed to crawl across the concrete floor and grab Thomas's ankle. The sudden pull threw Thomas off balance, and he released Helen as he fell. The distraction was enough for Helen to grab the wrench again. This time, her blow caught Thomas squarely in the temple, and he collapsed without making a sound. Helen immediately began working on Floyd's restraints while Burke struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. "The keys," Burke gasped, pointing toward Thomas's unconscious form. "For the cells." Floyd nodded as Helen freed his hands. The first priority was getting the other victims out of this nightmare basement. But as he knelt beside Thomas to search for keys, Floyd noticed something that made his blood run cold. Thomas's eyes were open, and he was smiling. "Too late," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "The others, they're already here." Before Floyd could ask what he meant, the sound of vehicles approaching the cabin drifted down from above. Multiple engines moving fast through the snow. "Back up," Helen asked hopefully, but Floyd had a sinking feeling that wasn't the case. Thomas had mentioned colleagues, other researchers who shared his interests, and the timing was too convenient, as if someone had been watching and waiting for the right moment to intervene. "We need to get out of here," Floyd said urgently. "Right now." He found the keys on Thomas's belt and quickly began unlocking the cells. The women inside were in various states of physical and mental deterioration, some barely conscious, others completely catatonic. Getting them all to safety would be nearly impossible under the best circumstances. The sound of footsteps on the cabin floor above them confirmed Floyd's worst fears. Whoever had arrived wasn't there to help. "Agent Morrison," a voice called from upstairs. We know you're down there. Come up slowly, with your hands visible." Floyd didn't recognize the voice, but the tone was unmistakably official. These weren't local law enforcement officers. "FBI?" Burke whispered. Floyd shook his head. Something about this felt wrong. If these were federal agents, why hadn't they identified themselves properly? Why the threatening tone? "We have the building surrounded," the voice continued. "You have 60 seconds to come upstairs, or we'll be forced to take more aggressive action." Floyd looked around the basement at the terrified women, at Burke's bleeding form, at Helen, who was barely standing. They were trapped underground with no other exits, facing an unknown number of opponents who might be willing to kill everyone in the basement to cover up Thomas's operation. But it was Helen who provided the answer. "There's another way out," she whispered, pointing toward the far corner of the basement. "Thomas showed me. There's a tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft about a quarter-mile from here." Floyd could see what appeared to be a narrow opening partially concealed behind stacked boxes. It would be a tight fit, and getting the other victims through would be challenging, but it might be their only chance. 30 seconds, the voice from upstairs called. Floyd made his decision. "Burke, can you walk?" The sheriff nodded, though Floyd could see it was going to be difficult for him. "Helen, start getting the women into that tunnel. I'll be right behind you." But as they began moving toward the hidden passage, Thomas stirred on the floor. His eyes opened, and the terrible smile returned to his face. "You think you've won," he said, his voice stronger now. "But you don't understand what you're really dealing with. This goes so much deeper than one cabin in the woods." "Shut up," Floyd said, but Thomas continued. "The research will continue, Agent Morrison. With or without me. There are facilities like this one all across the country, all connected, all working toward the same goal." "What goal?" Thomas's smile widened. "Perfect control. Imagine being able to edit human memory like a film reel, removing inconvenient truths, implanting desired behaviors. We're on the verge of creating the perfect citizen. Compliant, obedient, with no memory of how things used to be." The implications of what Thomas was describing hit Floyd like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just about one psychopath torturing women in a basement. This was part of something much larger, something that could threaten the very foundation of free society. "Time's up," the voice from upstairs shouted, and Floyd could hear boots on the stairs. There was no more time for questions. Floyd grabbed Helen and Burke and pushed them toward the tunnel opening, as the first of their pursuers appeared at the bottom of the basement stairs. The tunnel was even smaller than it had appeared from a distance, barely wide enough for one person to crawl through at a time. Floyd went last, pulling boxes back into place to conceal the entrance as much as possible. Behind them, he could hear voices in the basement, the sound of the cell doors being opened, and then an ominous silence. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a claustrophobic nightmare of damp earth and rotting timber supports. Floyd lost track of time as they crawled through the darkness, following the faint sounds of the others ahead of him. When they finally emerged into daylight, Floyd was surprised to see that the storm had stopped and the sun was setting. They were in a small clearing dominated by the entrance to an abandoned mine shaft, just as Helen had said. But their relief was short-lived. As they helped the rescued women out of the tunnel, Floyd realized that several of them were in critical condition. They needed medical attention immediately, and they were still miles from help. "We need to get to a phone," Floyd said, looking around for any sign of civilization. "There's a ranger station about 2 miles that way," Burke said, pointing east. "If we can make it there." But before he could finish the sentence, the sound of helicopter rotors filled the air. Floyd looked up to see a black aircraft circling overhead, and his heart sank. Whoever had been at the cabin was still hunting them. "Into the mine," Floyd ordered. "Everyone, get into the mine shaft." They helped the weakened women into the dark opening, just as the helicopter landed in the clearing. Floyd was the last to enter, and as he did, he caught a glimpse of the men emerging from the aircraft. They wore no identifying uniforms, carried military-grade weapons, and moved with the precision of professionals. But what chilled Floyd to the bone was their apparent lack of concern for the women they'd presumably come to rescue. These weren't rescuers. They were cleaners. Inside the mine shaft, Floyd gathered the group around him in the darkness. "Listen to me," he whispered urgently. "The people outside aren't here to help us. They're here to make sure no one ever learns about what happened in that cabin." "What do we do?" Helen asked. Floyd thought frantically. They were trapped in an abandoned mine with several critically injured women, pursued by what appeared to be a professional cleanup crew, and no way to call for help. But then he remembered something Thomas had said. Facilities like this one all across the country, all connected, all working toward the same goal. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Thomas Fairchild hadn't been working alone, and he hadn't been working for himself. He'd been part of something much larger, something with "Burke," Floyd whispered. "When we get out of this, we can't report this through normal channels." "What do you mean?" "I mean, whoever Thomas was working for has people inside the system. People who can make evidence disappear, who can silence witnesses, who can turn a federal investigation into a cover-up." The sheriff was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implications. "So, what do? We survive," Floyd said grimly. "We get these women to safety, and then we figure out who we can trust." But even as he said the words, Floyd wasn't sure it would be possible. The tunnel they'd used to escape would be discovered soon, and their pursuers had helicopters and professional tracking equipment. As they huddled in the darkness of the abandoned mine, listening to the sounds of their hunters searching the area outside, Floyd realized that their ordeal was far from over. In fact, it might be just beginning. The women they'd rescued would need new identities, new lives, complete protection from whatever organization Thomas had been working for. And Floyd himself would need to be very careful about who he trusted within the Bureau. Because if Thomas had been telling the truth about the scope of this conspiracy, then Floyd Morrison had just stumbled into something that could destroy him and everyone he cared about. The sound of footsteps outside the mine entrance made everyone freeze. Someone was coming. Floyd drew his weapon and positioned himself between the approaching footsteps and the women huddled behind him. In the darkness, he couldn't see much, but he could hear voices getting closer. "Check the mine shaft," someone said. They couldn't have gotten far. Floyd held his breath and waited. In a few moments, he would know whether they had found temporary safety or walked into a trap. But one thing was certain. The nightmare that had started with Helen Patterson's disappearance was far from over, and Floyd was beginning to suspect that it might never truly end. The morning of April 12, 1965, dawned crisp and clear in downtown Chicago, with the kind of spring air that carried promises of warmer days ahead. FBI agent Archie Kellerman stood outside the First National Bank of Illinois, watching the crime scene technicians pack up their equipment after 3 days of intensive investigation. The bank robbery that had occurred on Monday morning should have been a straightforward case. Masked gunmen, stolen money, witness statements, and forensic evidence. But nothing about this particular robbery had been straightforward. Archie had been with the Bureau for 12 years, long enough to develop an instinct for when something wasn't right about a case. And everything about the First National robbery felt wrong. From the precision of the operation to the curious behavior of the witnesses, to the fact that one of the robbers had seemed to know exactly where to find the bank's most valuable contents. The robbery itself had lasted exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds, according to the bank's recently installed security clock. 3 men had entered the bank at 10:17 a.m., just as the morning rush was beginning to die down. They'd worn identical dark suits and white masks that covered their entire faces, giving them an almost theatrical appearance that several witnesses had found unnaturving. What made the robbery unusual wasn't just the precision of the operation, but the specific nature of what had been stolen. The robbers had ignored the cash in the teller's drawers, easily accessible money that most bank robbers would have grabbed first. Instead, they'd gone directly to the safety deposit box vault, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. Bank manager Gladys Morton had been forced at gunpoint to open the vault, and the robbers had proceeded to open 7 specific safety deposit boxes. Not random boxes, not the largest boxes, but 7 particular boxes that they'd apparently selected in advance. They'd removed the contents of these boxes, loaded everything into leather satchels, and left the bank as calmly as they'd entered. The total value of what had been stolen was still being calculated, but preliminary estimates suggested it was well over $200,000 in cash, jewelry, and bonds. More troubling was the fact that the contents of several boxes had included items that weren't supposed to exist, documents and photographs that, according to the box owners, should have been destroyed years ago. Archie climbed the steps to the bank's entrance, nodding to the security guard who'd been posted there since the robbery. The bank had reopened for business on Tuesday, but the atmosphere inside remained tense. Employees spoke in hushed tones, and customers conducted their business quickly before hurrying back to the safety of the street. Gladys Morton was waiting for him in her office, a small cluttered space behind the main, banking floor. She was a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of steady demeanor that had made her an effective bank manager for nearly 2 decades. But the events of Monday morning had clearly shaken her more than she was willing to admit. "Agent Kellerman," she said, rising from behind her desk, "I wasn't expecting you back today." "I have a few more questions, Mrs. Morton. I hope you don't mind." "Of course not. Anything that might help catch those men." Archie settled into the chair across from her desk and pulled out his notebook. "I've been going over your statement from Monday, and there are a few details I'd like to clarify." "Certainly. You mentioned that the leader of the group, the one who spoke to you, seemed familiar somehow. Have you had any additional thoughts about that?" Gladys shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I've been thinking about it constantly, Agent Kellerman. There was something about his voice, his mannerisms, but I can't place it. What about the way he knew to ask specifically for access to the safety deposit vault? Most bank robbers go for the cash first. That's what troubled me most. He knew exactly where the vault was located, knew that I would have the master key, even knew the procedure for opening the individual boxes." Archie made notes as she spoke. "Mrs. Morton, in your experience, how many people would have that level of detailed knowledge about your bank's security procedures?" "Honestly, very few. Current employees certainly. Former employees who worked in sensitive positions. Bank examiners. Maybe some of the construction workers who installed the vault system 2 years ago. What about customers who rent safety deposit boxes? They would know the general layout, but not the specific security procedures. And they certainly wouldn't know which boxes contained the most valuable contents." That was the detail that had been nagging at Archie since Monday. The robbers hadn't selected their target boxes randomly. They'd known exactly which ones to open, as if they'd had access to detailed records of the contents. "Mrs. Morton, I need to ask you about the bank's customer records. Who would have access to information about what people keep in their safety deposit boxes? That information is highly confidential. Only myself and my assistant manager would have complete access to those records. Your assistant manager being Irving Rothstein. He's been with the bank for 8 years, completely trustworthy. Archie made a note of the name. What about other employees? Tellers, security guards, cleaning staff. They wouldn't have access to safety deposit box records. That information is kept in a locked filing cabinet in my office. And who has keys to that cabinet? Just myself and Irving. Archie looked around the office, noting the filing cabinet in question. It was a heavy steel model with 2 locks, the kind that would require considerable effort to break into without the proper keys. Mrs. Morton, have you noticed anything missing from your files? Any signs that someone might have gone through the safety deposit box records? I checked thoroughly after the robbery. Everything appears to be in order. But as she said this, Gladys's eyes flickered toward the filing cabinet in a way that suggested she wasn't entirely certain. Archie decided to press the point. Would you mind if we went through those files together? Just to be absolutely sure? I suppose that would be all right. Gladys unlocked the filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder containing index cards for each safety deposit box customer. The records were organized numerically by box number, and each card contained basic information about the renter, as well as notes about the general nature of the contents. As they went through the cards, Archie noticed something odd. 7 cards, corresponding to the 7 boxes that had been robbed, showed signs of recent handling. The edges were slightly worn, as if they'd been removed from the file and replaced multiple times. Mrs. Morton, do you notice anything unusual about these particular cards? She examined them carefully. They do look like they've been handled more than the others, but I can't remember specifically pulling these files recently. What about Irving? Would he have reason to access these particular records? Not unless a customer had a specific inquiry or problem with their box. Archie made detailed notes about each of the 7 targeted boxes. The owners included a retired judge, a prominent businessman, the widow of a former city official, and several other individuals who seemed to have little in common beyond their wealth and social status. Mrs. Morton, I'd like to speak with Irving Rothstein. Is he here today? He called in sick this morning. First time he's missed work since the robbery. That raised another red flag for Archie. Has he been acting unusually since Monday? Now that you mention it, yes. He seemed very nervous during the investigation, kept asking when the FBI would be finished with their questions. What's Irving's home address? Gladys provided the information, and Archie made plans to visit Rothstein later that day. But first, he wanted to interview the witness who'd provided the most detailed description of the robbers. Norma Fitzpatrick worked as a secretary for a law firm 2 blocks from the bank. She'd been making a deposit when the robbery occurred and had remained remarkably calm throughout the ordeal, providing the police with detailed observations about the robbers' behavior and appearance. Archie found her at her office during her lunch break. A neat, professional woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and an excellent memory for detail. Miss Fitzpatrick, thank you for agreeing to speak with me again. Of course, Agent Kellerman. I hope I can be of help. I've read your statement from Monday, but I was hoping you might have remembered additional details about the robbery. Actually, I have. There was something about the way the robbers moved that struck me as odd. How so? They moved like they'd rehearsed the entire operation. Not just the general plan, but every specific movement. The leader knew exactly how many steps it was from the front door to Mrs. Morton's office. The second man went directly to the safety deposit vault without hesitation, as if he'd been there before. Did you get the impression that any of them were familiar with the bank's layout? Absolutely, but more than that, they seemed to know the staff. When Mrs. Morton started to reach for something under her desk, probably an alarm button, the leader stopped her before she could even move her hand. It was like he knew what she was thinking. This was new information that hadn't been in Norma's original statement. Miss Fitzpatrick, why didn't you mention this to the police on Monday? I wasn't sure if it was important, but I've been thinking about it all week, and I'm convinced that at least one of those men had been in the bank before. Did you recognize any of them specifically? That's just it. I can't say for certain. They were completely disguised. But there was something about the leader's posture, the way he held his shoulders. I've seen it before, but I can't place where. Archie spent another 20 minutes with Norma, going over every detail of her observations. By the time he left her office, he was convinced that the robbery had been an inside job. The level of specific knowledge the robbers had displayed could only have come from someone with intimate access to the bank's operations. Irving Rothstein lived in a modest apartment building on the north side, in a neighborhood that was showing signs of the urban renewal that was sweeping through Chicago in the mid-1960s. Archie climbed 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B and knocked on the door. There was no answer. Archie knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Rothstein, FBI, I'd like to speak with you about the bank robbery." Still no response, but Archie could hear movement inside the apartment, the sound of someone trying to move quietly across a wooden floor. "Mr. Rothstein, I know you're in there. I just want to ask you a few questions." The door opened slowly to reveal a thin, nervous-looking man in his early 40s. Irving Rothstein had the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors, and his hand shook slightly as he gripped the door frame. "Agent Kellerman? I wasn't expecting. I'm not feeling well today." "I can see that. May I come in? This won't take long." Irving hesitated, then stepped aside to let Archie enter. The apartment was small but tidy, with the kind of careful organization that suggested its occupant lived alone and took pride in his surroundings. But Archie noticed that several drawers were partially open, and there were papers scattered on the kitchen table as if Irving had been going through them hastily. "Mr. Rothstein, I understand you've worked at First National for 8 years. That's right?" "Started as a teller, worked my way up to assistant manager." "Mrs. Morton speaks very highly of you, says you're completely trustworthy." Irving's nervousness seemed to increase at the mention of his supervisor. "Mrs. Morton is a wonderful woman to work for, very professional, very thorough." "I'm sure she is." "Mr. Rothstein, I need to ask you about your access to the bank's safety deposit box records." "What about them?" "Mrs. Morton tells me that you and she are the only employees with access to those files." "That's correct." "Have you had occasion to review those files recently?" "Specifically, the records for boxes 247, 318, 402, 503, 661, 729, and 834? The specific box numbers had an immediate effect on Irving. His face went white, and he sank into a chair at the kitchen table. "Mr. Rothstein, are you all right? I need to tell you something, Agent Kellerman, but you have to understand, I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Archie felt the familiar rush that came with a breakthrough in a case. "What do you need to tell me, Irving?" "The robbery. I provided information to the men who robbed the bank." "What kind of information?" "Details about the security procedures, the layout of the vault, which safety deposit boxes contained the most valuable items." Archie sat down across from Irving, keeping his voice calm and professional. "How did you come to provide this information?" They approached me about 3 months ago, said they knew I had gambling debts, knew I was in financial trouble. Who approached you? I never got their real names, but they knew things about me, personal things. They knew about my mother's medical bills, about the money I'd borrowed from the wrong people. Irving's story was one Archie had heard variations of many times before. Criminals identifying vulnerable targets, people with financial problems or personal secrets that could be exploited. What did they threaten you with? They said if I didn't help them, they'd make sure my gambling debts became public knowledge. I'd lose my job, maybe face criminal charges for some of the bets I'd placed. So, you agreed to help them rob your own bank. I never thought it would actually happen. They said they just wanted information, that they were planning to rob a different bank and needed to understand how safety deposit systems worked. But Archie could see in Irving's eyes that he'd known exactly what the information would be used for. Irving, I need you to tell me everything about these men. What they looked like, how they contacted you, where you met them. We never met in person until the day before the robbery. All the communication was through phone calls and letters left in a drop location. What drop location? A mailbox at the main post office downtown. They gave me a box number and a combination. Irving provided Archie with the details, though he suspected the drop location had already been abandoned. Professional criminals rarely use the same communication method for extended periods. The day before the robbery, one of them called and said they needed to meet in person to finalize the details. We met at a diner on Western Avenue. Can you describe him? Middle-aged, average height, brown hair. But there was something about him that scared me. The way he looked at me, like I was just a tool to be used and then discarded. Did he give you any indication of what they planned to do with the stolen items? He said it wasn't about the money. Said the things in those safety deposit boxes were worth more than cash to the right people. That confirmed what Archie had been suspecting. The robbery hadn't been about simple theft. It had been about obtaining specific items that someone wanted very badly. Irving, I need you to think carefully. Did this man mention any names, any locations, anything that might help us identify who he was working for? There was one thing. When he was leaving, he got a phone call. I heard him say something about reporting to the organization, and that everything was proceeding according to plan. The organization? That's all I heard. But Agent Kellerman, there's something else you need to know. What's that? They didn't just rob the bank for money or jewelry. Some of those safety deposit boxes contained documents, papers that certain people apparently wanted very badly. What kind of documents? I don't know specifics, but one of the box owners called the bank yesterday. He was terrified, said the papers that were stolen could ruin him if they became public. Archie felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to come together. The robbery hadn't been a simple crime of opportunity. It had been a carefully planned operation designed to obtain specific materials that could be used for blackmail or extortion. Irving, who called? Which box owner? Judge Harriman. Box 402. He said the stolen documents contained information that could destroy his career and his family. Archie made detailed notes as Irving provided additional information about the conversation with Judge Harriman. The picture that was emerging was deeply troubling. A sophisticated criminal organization that was using bank robbery as a cover for obtaining blackmail material. But as Archie prepared to leave Irving's apartment, the nervous bank employee provided one final piece of information that would change the entire direction of the investigation. Agent Kellerman, there's one more thing. The man I met at the diner, he said something that didn't make sense to me at the time. What did he say? He said that after the robbery, I should be very careful about who I talk to. said that the organization had people everywhere, even inside law enforcement. The words sent a chill down Archie's spine. If Irving was telling the truth, then the bank robbery was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. And if the organization really did have people inside law enforcement, then Archie himself might be walking into a trap. As he left Irving's building and walked to his car, Archie found himself looking over his shoulder, wondering if he was being watched. The spring afternoon that had seemed so pleasant earlier now felt ominous, full of unseen threats and hidden dangers. The bank robbery case was becoming something much more complicated than he'd anticipated, and Archie was beginning to suspect that before it was over, his own life might be in danger. The phone in Archie's apartment rang at 3:17 a.m. on Thursday morning, jolting him from an uneasy sleep. He'd been dreaming about masked figures in locked vaults, and for a moment the sound of the telephone seemed to blend with the phantoms in his subconscious. By the fourth ring, he was fully awake and reaching for the receiver. Kellerman. Agent Kellerman, this is Detective Raymond Walsh, Chicago PD. We've got a situation that I think you need to see. Archie glanced at his bedside clock, confirming the ungodly hour. What kind of situation? Your witness from the bank robbery, Norma Fitzpatrick. She's dead. The words hit Archie like a physical blow. He sat up in bed, suddenly completely alert. What happened? Apparent suicide. Neighbor found her hanging in her apartment about an hour ago. But Agent Kellerman, there are some things about this scene that don't sit right with me. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Archie dressed quickly and drove through the empty Chicago streets to Norma's apartment building. Police cars and an ambulance crowded the narrow street, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows on the brick buildings. Detective Walsh met him at the building's entrance, a heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much during his years on the force. "Third floor," Walsh said as they climbed the stairs. Landlord found the door unlocked when he came to check on a water leak. Norma was hanging from a ceiling beam in the living room. Suicide note? That's one of the things that bothers me. No note, but there was a typewritten letter on her kitchen table, real formal, like a business document. They reached the third floor, where crime scene photographers were finishing their work. Archie could see into Norma's apartment through the open door, and what he saw made his stomach clench with suspicion. The scene was too neat, too organized. Norma's apartment had been immaculate when he'd visited her at work, and even in death everything remained in perfect order. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication that she'd been in distress before taking her own life. "Can I see the letter?" Archie asked. Walsh handed him a typed page in a clear evidence bag. The letter was brief and to the point. "I can no longer live with the guilt of what I witnessed at the bank. I should have tried to stop those men, should have done something to help. I cannot bear the weight of knowing that my cowardice contributed to this crime. Please forgive me." It was signed Norma Fitzpatrick, in what appeared to be her handwriting. "Detective Walsh, does this sound like the woman I interviewed yesterday? She was calm, professional, helpful. She showed no signs of guilt or distress about the robbery. That's what struck me, too. Neighbor says Norma seemed normal when she saw her Tuesday evening. No indication she was contemplating suicide." Archie studied the apartment more carefully, looking for anything that might contradict the suicide scenario. The kitchen was clean, dishes washed and put away. The bed was made with military precision. Even the trash can was empty, as if someone had taken care to leave no evidence behind. "Walsh, has the coroner examined the body yet?" "Preliminary look only." But he mentioned something about bruising on her wrists that seemed inconsistent with hanging. That clinched it for Archie. Norma Fitzpatrick had been murdered, and her death was directly related to the bank robbery. Someone had decided that her detailed observations made her too dangerous to leave alive. "I need to see Irving Rothstein," Archie said urgently. "Right now." "The bank employee you interviewed yesterday." "Why?" "Because if they killed Norma to silence her, Irving could be next." They drove to Irving's apartment building with sirens wailing through the pre-dawn darkness. Archie took the stairs 3 at a time, with Walsh close behind. The door to apartment 3B was slightly ajar, which immediately set off alarm bells in Archie's mind. "Irving," Archie called out as he pushed the door open. "Irving Rothstein." The apartment was in chaos. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere, cushions slashed open. But there was no sign of Irving. "Looks like they got here first," Walsh said grimly. Archie moved through the apartment systematically, cataloging the destruction. This hadn't been a simple burglary. Someone had been looking for something specific, and they'd torn the place apart to find it. In the bedroom, Archie found signs of a struggle. Blood on the carpet, a broken lamp, drag marks leading toward the window. He looked out to see a fire escape that provided access to the alley behind the building. "They took him alive," Archie said, "which means they needed information from him." "Information about what?" "About who else knows what Irving told me yesterday." The implications were chilling. If Irving had been kidnapped rather than killed outright, it meant his captors wanted to know exactly how much the FBI had learned about their operation. And that put Archie himself in immediate danger. "Detective Walsh, I need you to contact my supervisor immediately. Tell him that the bank robbery is connected to organized crime, possibly with corruption inside law enforcement." "You think cops are involved?" "Irving warned me that this organization has people everywhere. That could include the Bureau, Chicago PD, anyone with access to our investigation." As they left Irving's destroyed apartment, Archie noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It hadn't been there when they'd arrived, and something about it made his instincts scream danger. "Walsh," he said quietly. "Don't look back, but I think we're being watched." The detective's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. "The black car?" "Yeah. Let's get back to our vehicles normally, but be ready for anything." They walked down the street at a casual pace, but Archie could feel eyes watching them from the sedan. When they reached their cars, the black vehicle's engine started. "Follow me," Archie told Walsh. "But not too closely. I want to see if they're tracking us." The next 20 minutes became a careful game of cat and mouse through Chicago's morning traffic. The black sedan stayed with them, always maintaining a distance but never losing sight of Archie's car. Whoever was driving was professional, experienced in surveillance techniques. Archie led them on a winding route through the city, testing whether the tail would break off or continue following. When it became clear that the sedan wasn't going to give up, Archie made a decision that would prove to be both brave and foolish. He pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the south side and waited. The black sedan circled the block twice before parking across the street. Archie could see 2 figures inside, but the morning sun on the windshield made it impossible to identify them clearly. "What's the plan?" Walsh asked over the radio. "I'm going to confront them. Maybe it's time to find out who's been watching us." "That's not smart, Kellerman. We should call for backup." But Archie was already out of his car, walking across the street toward the sedan. As he approached, he could see the 2 occupants more clearly. Both men were wearing dark suits and had the kind of alert, professional bearing that suggested law enforcement or military backgrounds. The driver rolled down his window as Archie approached. "Agent Kellerman," the man said, his voice calm and controlled. "We need to talk." "Who are you?" "Special Agent Marcus Cole, Internal Affairs Division. This is Agent Richardson. We've been assigned to monitor your investigation." Archie felt a chill run down his spine. Internal Affairs only got involved when there were suspicions of corruption or misconduct within the Bureau. Either he was being investigated, or his superiors suspected that the bank robbery case involved federal agents. "Monitor my investigation for what purpose?" "Get in the car, Agent Kellerman. There are things you need to know about this case that go far beyond a simple bank robbery." Against his better judgment, Archie climbed into the back seat of the sedan. Agent Cole turned to face him, his expression serious. "Agent Kellerman, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. The bank robbery you've been investigating is part of a much larger operation that involves national security." "What kind of operation?" "For the past 2 years, various federal agencies have been tracking a criminal organization that specializes in obtaining sensitive documents and using them for blackmail and extortion. The organization has compromised politicians, judges, businessmen, and law enforcement officials across the Midwest." Richardson handed Archie a thick file folder. The documents stolen from those safety deposit boxes weren't random targets. Each one contained evidence of corruption, bribery, or other illegal activities. Someone is building a comprehensive database of compromising information. Archie flipped through the file, seeing photographs, financial records, and surveillance reports. The scope of what he was looking at was staggering. A criminal network that had been operating for years, collecting ammunition to use against anyone who might threaten their interests. "Why wasn't I briefed on this from the beginning?" "Because we weren't sure if you could be trusted," Cole said bluntly. "The organization has successfully placed assets inside multiple law enforcement agencies. We needed to observe your investigation to determine whether you were compromised. And your conclusion. You're clean, but you're also in immediate danger. The murder of Norma Fitzpatrick and the kidnapping of Irving Rothstein prove that they're willing to eliminate anyone who threatens their operation." Archie felt the weight of the situation settling on him like a heavy blanket. He'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple bank robbery, and now his life was in jeopardy. "What about Irving? Is he still alive?" "We don't know, but if he is, he won't be for long. The organization doesn't leave loose ends." Richardson leaned forward. "Agent Kellerman, we have a proposition for you. Help us bring down this organization, and we'll provide you with federal protection. Refuse, and you're on your own against people who have already killed to protect their secrets." "What kind of help are you talking about?" "We want you to continue your investigation, but with backup and support from Internal Affairs. We'll provide you with secure communications, safe houses, and additional agents to watch your back." "In exchange for what?" "Your complete cooperation and willingness to follow orders without question. This operation is too important to be compromised by individual initiative." Archie considered the offer. On one hand, he desperately needed protection and support. On the other hand, he'd learned to be suspicious of anyone offering help too readily. "I need some time to think about this." "Time is a luxury you don't have," Cole said. "The organization knows you're getting close to something important. They'll move against you soon, probably within the next 24 hours. As if to emphasize his point, Cole's radio crackled to life with a coded message. After listening, he turned back to Archie with a grim expression. "Judge Harriman was found dead in his home an hour ago. Apparent heart attack. But there were no signs of heart disease in his medical records. Another murder, this one targeting the judge who'd called the bank about his stolen documents. the organization was systematically eliminating anyone who could connect them to the robbery. Agent Kellerman, you need to make a decision. Work with us or become the next victim. Archie looked out at the Chicago streets, thinking about Norma Fitzpatrick hanging in her apartment, about Irving Rothstein being dragged from his home, about Judge Harriman dying alone. Whatever this organization was, they had the resources and ruthlessness to kill anyone who threatened them. "All right," he said finally. "I'll cooperate. But I want some guarantees, such as complete honesty about the scope of this investigation. No more surprises, no more classified information that suddenly becomes relevant. And I want to know exactly who we're dealing with." Cole and Richardson exchanged glances before Cole nodded. "Fair enough. The organization calls itself the Syndicate, and it's led by a man we know only as the director. He's been operating in the shadows for at least 5 years, building a network of corrupt officials and criminal associates. What's his ultimate goal? Power, control, the ability to manipulate political and business decisions through blackmail and intimidation. The bank robbery was just one operation in a much larger campaign. Richardson pulled out a surveillance photograph showing a tall, well-dressed man in his 50s getting out of a luxury car. This is the only clear photo we have of the director. He was photographed outside a Chicago hotel 3 weeks ago, but by the time our agents arrived, he'd disappeared." Archie studied the photograph, trying to memorize the man's features. The director looked like any successful businessman, the kind of person who could walk into any corporate boardroom or government office without attracting attention. How do we find him? We don't. We let him find us. The organization is going to come after you, Agent Kellerman, and when they do, we'll be ready for them. The plan that Cole outlined was both simple and terrifying. Archie would continue his investigation publicly, making himself an obvious target for the syndicate. When they moved against him, internal affairs agents would be positioned to capture members of the organization and force them to reveal information about their leadership. "You're asking me to be bait," Archie said. "Yes, but bait with the full protection of the federal government." Archie agreed to the plan, though every instinct told him that he was walking into a trap. As they drove him back to his car, Cole provided him with a special radio frequency for emergency communication and the address of a safe house where he could retreat if the situation became too dangerous. "One more thing," Richardson said as Archie prepared to leave. "Don't trust anyone else with information about this operation. The syndicate has demonstrated an ability to compromise law enforcement at every level, including the FBI, especially the FBI." Archie drove back to his apartment, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd learned. The bank robbery had been just the tip of an iceberg, a small part of a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and law enforcement. As he parked outside his building, Archie noticed that his apartment windows were dark, though he was certain he'd left a lamp burning when he'd rushed out earlier. Someone had been inside his home. He drew his weapon and approached the building carefully, using the shadows for cover. The front door was locked, showing no signs of forced entry. But when he reached his apartment on the second floor, he could see that the lock had been professionally picked. The apartment had been searched with the same thoroughness that had been applied to Irving's place, but with much more care. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but Archie could tell that every drawer had been opened, every closet examined, every hiding place investigated. On his kitchen table was a single sheet of paper with a typewritten message. "Agent Kellerman, you have become involved in matters that don't concern you. Cease your investigation immediately and return to routine duties, or face the consequences that befell your witnesses." You have 24 hours to comply. This is your only warning. The message was unsigned, but Archie had no doubt about its source. The syndicate knew where he lived, knew about his investigation, and was prepared to kill him if he didn't back off. But rather than being intimidated, Archie felt a cold anger building inside him. Norma Fitzpatrick had died because she'd tried to help the FBI solve a crime. Irving Rothstein had been kidnapped because he'd cooperated with a federal investigation. Judge Harriman was dead because criminals had stolen documents from his safety deposit box. The syndicate had made this personal, and Archie was determined to make them pay for their crimes. He called the emergency number Cole had given him and arranged to meet at the safe house. As he gathered essential items from his apartment, Archie reflected on how quickly his life had changed. 48 hours ago, he'd been investigating a simple bank robbery. Now, he was a marked man, hunted by a criminal organization with connections throughout law enforcement. But as he prepared to leave his apartment, possibly for the last time, Archie made a decision that would define the rest of the investigation. He wasn't going to be passive bait in someone else's trap. He was going to hunt the hunters, and he was going to bring down the syndicate no matter what it cost him. The war between Agent Archie Kellerman and the director was about to begin in earnest, and only one of them would survive it. The safe house turned out to be a nondescript two-story building in an industrial district on Chicago's west side, sandwiched between a metalworking shop and an abandoned warehouse. Archie arrived at midnight to find the building dark, except for a single light in an upstairs window. Agent Cole met him at a side entrance, his face grim in the pale streetlight. "Any trouble getting here?" Cole asked as he led Archie through a narrow hallway that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. "Not that I could detect. But after what happened to my apartment, I'm not sure I'd notice professional surveillance." They climbed a set of worn wooden stairs to the second floor, where Archie found himself in what appeared to be a makeshift command center. Charts and photographs covered the walls. Multiple phone lines snaked across tables loaded with radio equipment, and Agent Richardson sat hunched over a bank of monitors showing various locations around the city. "Welcome to Operation Cleanout," Cole said, gesturing toward the organized chaos around them. "For the past 6 months, this has been our base of operations for tracking the syndicate." Archie studied the wall displays more carefully. Surveillance photos showed dozens of individuals entering and leaving various Chicago locations. Financial charts tracked money flows through a complex network of the shell companies and overseas accounts. A large map of the Midwest was dotted with colored pins marking cities where the syndicate was suspected of operating. "This is bigger than you originally told me," Archie said. "Much bigger. The bank robbery was just one operation out of dozens. The syndicate has been systematically compromising officials in 12 states, building a network of corruption that reaches from local police departments to federal agencies." Richardson looked up from his monitors. "Agent Kellerman, we just intercepted a phone conversation that you need to hear." He handed Archie a set of headphones connected to a tape recorder. The conversation was between two men, their voices partially distorted by electronic encryption. "The FBI agent is becoming a problem," said the first voice. "He's asking too many questions, making connections we can't afford to have exposed." "Then eliminate him," replied the second voice, which carried an authority that suggested this was a superior giving orders to a subordinate. "Make it look like an accident. Car crash, mugging gone wrong, whatever works." "What about the internal affairs agents who've been watching him?" "They're a separate problem. The director has plans for them as well." The conversation continued for several more minutes, outlining a plan to eliminate not only Archie but also Agents Cole and Richardson. The casual way they discussed murder made Archie's blood run cold. "When was this recorded?" Archie asked. 2 hours ago. Richardson replied. "We have listening devices in several locations around the city, but we still haven't been able to identify the speakers or pinpoint where they're operating from." Cole moved to a large table covered with documents. "Agent Kellerman, there's something else you need to understand about this case. The syndicate isn't just a criminal organization. It's a shadow government, operating parallel to legitimate law enforcement and using corruption and blackmail to influence policy decisions." "What kind of policy decisions?" "Everything from local zoning approvals to federal law enforcement priorities. They've been manipulating the system from the inside, ensuring that their operations remain protected while their competitors are targeted for investigation and prosecution." Archie felt a growing sense of unease as the full scope of what they were dealing with became clear. "How long has this been going on?" "We think at least 5 years, possibly longer. The bank robbery that started your investigation was probably planned because Judge Harriman and the other box owners had been refusing to cooperate with syndicate demands." Richardson handed Archie another file. "Look at this. Financial records showing payments from various syndicate accounts to officials in Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, and a dozen other cities. We're talking about millions of dollars in bribes and kickbacks." The evidence was overwhelming, but it raised a disturbing question that had been nagging at Archie since the beginning. "If you've known about this organization for 6 months, why haven't you moved against them already?" Cole and Richardson exchanged glances before Cole answered. "Because we're not sure who we can trust within our own agencies. The syndicate has demonstrated an ability to stay ahead of our investigations, which suggests they have sources inside the Bureau. You think there are corrupt FBI agents involved? We're certain of it. 3 previous operations against the syndicate have been compromised before they could be executed. Each time, the targets were warned in advance and either disappeared or destroyed evidence before we could act. The implications were staggering. If the FBI itself had been compromised, then every aspect of law enforcement could be suspect. Phone calls could be monitored, evidence could be destroyed, and agents could be eliminated by their own colleagues. That's why we're operating out of this safe house instead of federal facilities," Richardson explained. "We can't risk having our communications intercepted or our plans leaked to the wrong people." Archie moved to the window and looked out at the darkened industrial district. Somewhere in the maze of Chicago's streets, a criminal organization was planning his death while corrupt federal agents provided them with information and protection. "What's the plan?" he asked. "We wait," Cole said. "The syndicate is going to make a move against you within the next 24 hours. When they do, we'll be ready to follow them back to their base of operations. And if they succeed in killing me, they won't. We have surveillance teams positioned around the city, and you'll be wearing a tracking device at all times." Cole handed Archie a small electronic device about the size of a matchbox. "This transmits your location every 30 seconds. If anything happens to you, we'll know exactly where you are." "What about Irving Rothstein?" "If he's still alive, shouldn't we be trying to rescue him?" "We are. But we need to be smart about it. The syndicate is using Irving as bait to draw us into a trap. If we move too quickly, they'll kill him and disappear." Richardson turned from his monitors with an urgent expression. "We've got movement." 3 vehicles just pulled up outside Agent Kellerman's apartment building. It looks like they're preparing to search the place again. They watched on the monitors as several figures in dark clothing entered Archie's building. The surveillance cameras were equipped with night vision capabilities, allowing them to see the intruders clearly as they moved through the hallways. "Professionals," Cole observed. "Look at how they move, how they communicate with hand signals. These aren't street criminals." "Military?" Archie asked. "Possibly. or law enforcement with military training. The intruders spent nearly an hour searching Archie's apartment, apparently looking for something specific. When they finally emerged, one of them made a phone call from the street outside the building. "We need to get closer," Richardson said. "If we can intercept that phone conversation, we might be able to identify who they're reporting to." But before they could react, the surveillance monitors went dark one by one. Someone was systematically disabling their cameras around the city. "They know about our surveillance network," Cole said grimly. "We're blind." The realization hit them like a physical blow. If the syndicate could identify and disable their monitoring equipment, it meant they had detailed knowledge of the internal affairs operation. There was definitely a leak inside federal law enforcement. "We need to move," Archie said. "If they know about this safe house, we're sitting ducks." "Agreed. But where do we go? If they have people inside the Bureau, no federal facility is safe." Richardson was already packing essential equipment into portable cases. "I know a place. My brother owns a fishing lodge about 50 miles north of the city. It's isolated. No phone service, no way for anyone to track us there." "How do we know your brother can be trusted?" "Because he doesn't know what we do for a living. As far as he's concerned, we're insurance investigators working on a fraud case." They loaded their equipment into 2 vehicles, taking different routes out of the city to avoid being followed. Archie found himself in Cole's sedan, watching the Chicago skyline disappear in the rearview mirror as they drove north through the darkness. "Agent Kellerman," Cole said, after they'd been driving for 20 minutes. "There's something I need to tell you about this investigation." "What?" "The bank robbery that started this whole thing wasn't random. The syndicate specifically targeted those safety deposit boxes because they knew we were getting close to exposing their operation." "What do you mean?" "Judge Harriman wasn't just another victim. He was secretly cooperating with our investigation, providing us with information about syndicate activities in the Chicago court system." Archie felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The documents in his safety deposit box contained evidence of syndicate corruption. Exactly. And when they robbed the bank, they didn't just steal evidence. They identified everyone who might have been cooperating with federal authorities. Irving Rothstein wasn't the only inside source. No. The syndicate has been systematically eliminating potential witnesses and informants. Norma Fitzpatrick was killed because her observations could have led to identification of the robbers. Judge Harriman died because he was actively working against them. The fishing lodge turned out to be a rustic cabin on the shores of a small lake surrounded by dense pine forest. Richardson's brother had left the key under a flower pot as promised, and they were able to settle in without attracting attention from any neighbors. Inside the cabin, they re-established their command center using portable equipment. Radio communications were limited, but they were able to maintain contact with other federal agents who were continuing the investigation in Chicago. "Any word on Irving?" Archie asked as Richardson tuned the radio frequencies. "Still alive, as far as we know. Our sources inside the Chicago PD report that his apartment has been under surveillance since yesterday, suggesting the syndicate is using it as a base of operations. Then we know where to find them." "It's not that simple." The building is located in a densely populated neighborhood, and any assault would put dozens of innocent civilians at risk. Cole spread a map of Chicago on the cabin's kitchen table. "We need to draw them out into the open, away from potential hostages. How? By giving them a target they can't resist." "You, Agent Kellerman." The plan that Cole outlined was both elegant and terrifying. Archie would return to Chicago and make himself visible, conducting his investigation in public locations where the syndicate would be forced to act in the open. When they moved against him, federal agents would be positioned to capture them and forced them to reveal Irving's location. "You're asking me to walk into the lion's den," Archie said. "Yes, but this time the lion won't see us coming." They spent the rest of the night refining the plan, identifying locations where Archie could conduct his investigation while remaining visible to syndicate surveillance. The key was to appear vulnerable while actually being protected by hidden federal agents. As dawn broke over the lake, Archie found himself thinking about the witnesses who had already died because of this case. Norma Fitzpatrick had tried to help the FBI and paid with her life. Judge Harriman had cooperated with federal investigators and been murdered for his efforts. "I want guarantees," Archie told Cole as they prepared to return to Chicago. "If this goes wrong, if I don't make it out alive, I want assurance that the investigation will continue. You have my word." "That's not enough." "I want documentation, copies of all evidence, backup plans in case the entire internal affairs team is compromised." Cole hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough. Richardson, prepare a complete case file for transmission to FBI headquarters. If anything happens to us, at least someone will know what we discovered." The drive back to Chicago took them through small towns that looked peaceful and innocent in the morning sunlight. Archie found it hard to believe that somewhere in this landscape, a criminal organization was planning murder while corrupt federal agents provided them with protection and information. But as they reached the outskirts of the city, Richardson's radio crackled to life with an urgent message. "All units, we have a body in the Chicago River. Adult male, appears to be a homicide victim." Archie felt his heart sink as the description continued. The victim matched Irving Rothstein's general description, and a wallet found on the body contained Irving's identification. "They killed him," Archie said quietly. "Maybe," Cole replied. "Or maybe they want us to think they killed him. The syndicate is smart enough to stage a fake death if it serves their purposes." But when they reached the morgue 2 hours later, there was no doubt about the identity of the victim. Irving Rothstein had been tortured before he was killed, his body showing signs of systematic abuse designed to extract information. "What did they want to know?" Archie asked the coroner. "Hard to say for certain, but the pattern of injuries suggests they were trying to get him to talk about something specific." Multiple sessions over several days. The coroner's report made for grim reading. Irving had been kept alive for nearly a week, while his captors used increasingly brutal methods to extract information from him. Whatever secrets he'd possessed, he'd taken them to his grave. "At least, we know he didn't break," Richardson said as they left the morgue. "If he'd told them everything he knew, they would have killed him immediately." But Archie wasn't so sure. Irving had been a frightened man who'd already betrayed his employers once for money. Under torture, he might have revealed everything about his cooperation with the FBI. "We have to assume they know everything Irving knew," Archie said. "That means they know about our investigation, our methods, possibly even our identities." "Which makes this operation even more dangerous," Cole agreed. "But also more necessary. If we don't stop them now, they'll continue killing witnesses and corrupting officials until they control the entire law enforcement system." As they drove through Chicago's busy streets, Archie noticed that they were being followed by the same black sedan he'd seen outside Irving's apartment building. The syndicate wasn't even trying to hide their surveillance anymore. "They're getting bold," Richardson observed. "Or desperate," Cole replied. "Either way, it means we're close to something important." The sedan followed them for several miles before breaking off near the downtown financial district. But Archie had the unsettling feeling that they were still being watched, possibly by assets the syndicate had placed throughout the city. "When do we start the operation?" Archie asked. "Tomorrow morning. We've arranged for you to meet with Gladys Morton at the bank. supposedly to follow up on some details of the robbery investigation. And then we see who comes out of the woodwork to silence you. That evening, Archie sat in his hotel room reviewing the case files and trying to prepare himself mentally for what was essentially a suicide mission. If the plan worked, they would identify and capture members of the syndicate. If it failed, he would join Norma Fitzpatrick, Judge Harriman, and Irving Rothstein in death. But as he studied the evidence they'd assembled, Archie began to notice patterns that hadn't been apparent before. Financial transactions that seemed to follow a specific schedule. Phone calls that were always made at certain times of day. Even the murders had occurred according to what appeared to be a predetermined timeline. The syndicate wasn't just organized. They were following a plan that had been months or possibly years in the making. The bank robbery hadn't been a crime of opportunity. It had been one step in a larger operation designed to consolidate their control over Chicago's criminal and political landscape. And Archie was beginning to suspect that tomorrow's operation might be walking directly into the climax of that plan. As he prepared for what might be his last night alive, Agent Archie Kellerman couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial about the case. Something that would change everything he thought he knew about the syndicate and their ultimate goals. But by morning, it would be too late to change the plan. The trap would be set, and either he would emerge victorious or become another casualty in a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. The morning of May 3rd, 1965, arrived with the kind of deceptive calm that often precedes violence. Archie sat in his hotel room at 6 a.m., methodically checking his weapon and reviewing the day's plan one final time. Outside his window, Chicago was waking up to what appeared to be another ordinary spring day. Office workers hurried along the sidewalks, delivery trucks navigated the busy streets, and the city's rhythm seemed completely normal. But Archie knew that beneath this veneer of normalcy, predators were already moving into position. The plan was elegantly simple in its deception. Archie would arrive at First National Bank at 9:30 a.m. for a scheduled meeting with Gladys Morton, ostensibly to review some final details about the robbery investigation. The meeting was genuine. Cole had arranged it through official FBI channels, ensuring that word of Archie's visit would reach anyone monitoring federal communications. What the syndicate wouldn't know was that the meeting was also bait. Cole's voice crackled through the radio hidden in Archie's jacket pocket. "All units in position. Archie, you're clear to proceed to the bank." Archie left his hotel and walked the 6 blocks to First National, taking his time and making sure he was visible to anyone who might be watching. The tracking device Cole had given him was secured inside his shoe, and he wore a wire that would allow the surveillance team to monitor any conversations. The morning air carried the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery and the exhaust fumes of rush-hour traffic. Everything seemed normal, but Archie's trained instincts told him he was being watched from multiple locations. As he approached the bank, Archie noticed several details that suggested the syndicate had taken the bait. A man in a gray suit was reading a newspaper on a bench across the street, but his eyes kept flicking toward the bank entrance. A woman at the bus stop had been standing in the same position for at least 10 minutes without any bus arriving. A delivery truck was parked at the curb with its engine running, even though the driver was nowhere to be seen. Professional surveillance, but not quite professional enough to be invisible to someone who knew what to look for. Archie entered the bank and was immediately greeted by Gladys Morton, who appeared nervous despite being briefed on the operation. She led him to her office, maintaining the pretense of a routine follow-up interview. "Agent Kellerman," she said once they were seated, "I'm not comfortable with this. If these people are as dangerous as you say, won't this put the bank's customers and employees at risk?" "Mrs. Morton, the building has been evacuated except for essential personnel, and there are federal agents positioned throughout the area. You're as safe as we can make you." But even as he said the words, Archie wondered if that was true. The syndicate had demonstrated an ability to stay ahead of federal investigations, and their willingness to commit murder suggested they wouldn't hesitate to kill innocent bystanders if it served their purposes. 20 minutes into their staged meeting, Archie's earpiece crackled with Richardson's voice. "We've got movement. 3 vehicles converging on the bank from different directions. This is it." Archie felt his pulse quicken as adrenaline flooded his system. After days of preparation, the moment of truth had arrived. "Mrs. Morton, I need you to go to the basement vault and stay there until this is over. Don't come out no matter what you hear." Gladys nodded and hurried from her office, leaving Archie alone to face whatever was coming. The first indication that something was wrong came when the bank's lights suddenly went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, but the main power had been cut with professional precision. "They're jamming our communications," Cole's voice said through heavy static in Archie's earpiece. "We're going to radio silence. Good luck." Archie drew his weapon and moved to the office window that overlooked the main banking floor. What he saw below made his blood run cold. 6 men in dark clothing had entered the bank, moving with military precision and carrying weapons that were far more sophisticated than anything typical bank robbers would possess. These weren't the same people who had committed the original robbery. These were professionals, possibly military contractors or corrupt federal agents. But what chilled Archie to the bone was the realization that they weren't there to rob the bank. They were there to kill him. The leader of the group gestured to his men, and they began systematically searching the building. They moved like a trained assault team, clearing each area methodically before advancing to the next. Archie retreated deeper into the office area, looking for a defensive position or an escape route. But the bank's layout worked against him. There were only 2 ways out of the building, and both were now controlled by the armed intruders. His earpiece crackled again, this time with a voice he didn't recognize. "Agent Kellerman, this is Director Phillips, FBI. Can you hear me?" Archie hesitated before responding. The voice carried authority, but given what Cole had told him about corruption within the Bureau, he couldn't be sure this was a legitimate federal agent. "This is Kellerman. Identify yourself properly." "Agent Kellerman, I'm the assistant director in charge of the Chicago field office. We have a situation that requires your immediate cooperation." "What kind of situation?" "The agents you've been working with, Cole and Richardson, are not legitimate federal personnel. They're part of the criminal organization you've been investigating." The words hit Archie like a physical blow. If Phillips was telling the truth, then everything he thought he knew about the investigation was wrong. "That's impossible. They've been helping me track the syndicate." "Agent Kellerman, Agents Cole and Richardson are the syndicate. They've been using you to identify and eliminate potential witnesses to their operation." Archie's mind raced as he tried to process this information. Cole and Richardson had certainly known a lot about the criminal organization, had seemed to anticipate their moves, had always been one step ahead of the investigation. If what you're saying is true, then why are armed men trying to kill me right now? Because you've learned too much. The original plan was to use you to identify all the witnesses and evidence, then eliminate you and close the case. But you've proven more resourceful than they expected. The sound of footsteps on the stairs leading to the office level interrupted their conversation. The assault team was getting closer. "Director Phillips, how do I know you're legitimate?" "Agent Kellerman, I'm going to give you information that only genuine federal personnel would know. The bank robbery was indeed an inside job, but not in the way you think. Irving Rothstein was working for us. He was an undercover federal agent who had infiltrated the syndicate." This revelation made Archie's head spin. Irving hadn't been a corrupt bank employee forced into cooperation. He'd been a federal agent working deep cover. Irving was our primary source of intelligence about the syndicate's operations. When he was kidnapped, we lost our window into their organization. Then why didn't Cole and Richardson tell me this? Because they're the ones who identified Irving as a federal agent and ordered his execution. Archie felt the world shifting beneath his feet as the full scope of the deception became clear. He'd been manipulated from the beginning, used as a tool by the very criminals he thought he was hunting. The office door burst open, and two armed men entered with weapons raised. Archie fired twice, dropping both intruders, but he could hear more footsteps approaching. "Director Phillips, I need immediate backup." "It's on the way, Agent Kellerman. But you need to stay alive for the next 10 minutes. Archie barricaded himself in Gladys Morton's office, using the heavy desk as cover while he tried to figure out his next move. The sound of gunfire echoed through the bank as the remaining assault team members closed in on his position. His earpiece crackled again, but this time it was Cole's voice. "Agent Kellerman, you need to listen to me very carefully. The person claiming to be Director Phillips is lying to you." "Cole? Where are you?" "Richardson and I are pinned down outside the bank. The people inside aren't federal agents. They're syndicate assassins sent to kill all of us." Archie didn't know who to believe anymore. Every voice in his earpiece could be legitimate law enforcement or criminal deception. "Cole, if you're really federal agents, then prove it. Tell me something only the Bureau would know. Agent Kellerman, your real name is Archibald James Kellerman, badge number 3847. You've been with the Bureau for 12 years, and your supervisor is Assistant Director Warren Mitchell." The information was accurate, but Archie realized that sophisticated criminals could have obtained those details through corruption or computer infiltration. "That's not enough, Cole. Anyone with access to personnel files could know that. Your father was killed in the line of duty when you were 16. He was a police officer in Detroit, shot during a bank robbery that was remarkably similar to the one we've been investigating." This information was more personal, the kind of detail that wouldn't be in official files. But Archie's paranoia had reached the point where he couldn't trust anyone. The sound of splintering wood indicated that the assault team was breaking down the office door. Archie had perhaps 30 seconds before they would breach his defensive position. "Whoever you really are," he said into his radio, "I need help right now. Agent Kellerman, this is Director Phillips again. The men outside the bank claiming to be federal agents are imposters. Do not trust them under any circumstances. And the men inside the bank trying to kill me? They're syndicate assassins. Your only chance is to get to the roof. A helicopter is en route to extract you." The office door exploded inward, and Archie found himself facing 3 heavily armed men who moved with the precision of professional soldiers. He dove behind the filing cabinet as bullets shredded the office furniture around him. Returning fire, Archie managed to wound one of the attackers, but he was severely outgunned and running low on ammunition. The stairway to the roof was blocked by the assault team, and the windows were too high for him to escape that way. That's when he remembered the safety deposit vault in the basement. If Gladys Morton was still down there, she might have access to an emergency exit or a way to contact legitimate law enforcement. Archie shot out the office window and fired several rounds into the air, hoping to confuse the assault team about his location. Then he slipped out of the office through a rear door and made his way toward the basement stairs. The basement was dark and filled with the mechanical sounds of the bank's heating and electrical systems. Archie called out softly for Gladys, but there was no response. As he moved deeper into the basement, Archie discovered something that changed his understanding of the entire situation. Hidden behind a false wall was a sophisticated communications center. complete with radio equipment, computer terminals, and surveillance monitors showing various locations around Chicago. The First National Bank wasn't just a financial institution, it was a front for intelligence operations. Agent Kellerman. Archie spun around to see Gladys Morton emerging from the shadows, but she was no longer the nervous bank manager he'd interviewed. She moved with the confidence of someone trained in intelligence work, and she was carrying a weapon. "Mrs. Morton, what is this place?" "This is the real reason the bank was robbed, Agent Kellerman. Not for money or safety deposit box contents, but to access this communications center. You're not really a bank manager. I'm Agent Gloria Whitman, CIA. This facility has been monitoring syndicate activities for the past 2 years. Another revelation that turned everything upside down. The bank robbery hadn't been about stealing documents or money. It had been an intelligence operation designed to compromise a federal surveillance post. Agent Whitman, I need to know who I can trust. There are people outside claiming to be federal agents, people inside trying to kill me, and voices on the radio giving me conflicting information. The truth is more complicated than you've been told. The syndicate isn't just a criminal organization. It's a rogue intelligence operation that includes personnel from multiple federal agencies. Gloria led him to the communications console and activated a secure channel. This is Blackbird Base. We have Agent Kellerman secure. Request immediate extraction. Blackbird Base, this is Control. Extraction team is en route. Be advised, the facility is compromised. Initiate destruction protocol. Gloria began entering codes into the computer system. Agent Kellerman, this entire facility is going to be destroyed in 5 minutes to prevent the syndicate from accessing our intelligence files. What about the people upstairs? They're not going to survive anyway. The syndicate doesn't leave witnesses. The reality of his situation hit Archie like a sledgehammer. He wasn't just caught in the middle of a bank robbery investigation. He was trapped in a battle between competing intelligence agencies with both sides willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. Agent Whitman, how do I know you're telling me the truth? Because if I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. I've had multiple opportunities to kill you since you entered the basement. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs indicated that, even if we survive, you'll never be able to speak about what happened here. What about justice for the people who were murdered? Norma Fitzpatrick, Judge Harriman, Irving Rothstein. Their deaths will be recorded as unrelated incidents. The official story will be that the bank robbery was solved and the perpetrators were killed resisting arrest. The first members of the assault team appeared at the bottom of the stairs, and the basement erupted in gunfire. Gloria proved to be an excellent shot, dropping 2 attackers before they could find cover. But Archie could see that they were still outnumbered and would eventually be overwhelmed. The extraction team better get here soon, he said, as bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls around them. Agent Kellerman, there's something else you need to know. The bank robbery was just one operation in a larger plan. The syndicate has been systematically compromising intelligence operations across the Midwest. What's their ultimate goal? To create a parallel intelligence network that operates outside government oversight. They want to control information flow and decision-making at the highest levels of government. A massive explosion from somewhere above them shook the entire building. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the basement filled with smoke. What was that? Archie coughed. The extraction team clearing a path to the roof. We need to move now. They fought their way through the remaining assault team members and climbed the stairs to the main banking floor. The building was filled with smoke and the acrid smell of explosives, but Archie could hear the sound of helicopter rotors outside. As they reached the roof, Archie saw a military helicopter hovering over the building, while federal agents rappelled down ropes to secure the area. But he also saw something else that made his blood run cold. Standing on a nearby rooftop, watching the operation through binoculars, was the man from the surveillance photograph. The mysterious figure that Cole and Richardson had identified as the director. Even from a distance, Archie could see that the man was smiling. "Agent Whitman," Archie shouted over the noise of the helicopter. "The director is watching us. He's on the building across the street." Gloria looked where Archie was pointing, and her face went white. "That's impossible. Intelligence reports indicated he was in Detroit this week." "Well, he's here now." As they were lifted into the helicopter, Archie kept his eyes on the distant figure. The director raised one hand in what might have been a salute or a gesture of farewell, then disappeared from view. During the flight to a secure federal facility, Gloria briefed Archie on what would happen next. "You'll be debriefed by multiple agencies, then reassigned to a position where you can't investigate intelligence operations. Your file on this case will be sealed, and you'll be required to sign documents agreeing never to discuss what happened. And the syndicate will continue operating under a different name in a different location. We disrupted one cell, but the organization is too large and too well connected to be completely eliminated. So, they win. They don't lose, which in the intelligence world is often the same thing." As Chicago disappeared beneath them, Archie reflected on everything he'd learned during the investigation. The bank robbery had been real, but it had been orchestrated by intelligence operatives rather than common criminals. The witnesses had been murdered not to cover up a simple crime, but to protect state secrets. And the corruption within law enforcement ran so deep that it might never be fully exposed. But the most disturbing realization was that he still didn't know who to trust. Gloria Whitman claimed to be CIA, but so had others who turned out to be criminals. The helicopter crew wore federal uniforms, but so had the assault team at the bank. In the world of intelligence operations, truth was a luxury that few could afford. As they approached the federal facility where he would be debriefed, Archie made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He would cooperate with whatever agencies claimed jurisdiction over the case, but he would also keep his own records of what had happened. Somewhere, somehow, he would find a way to ensure that the truth about the syndicate's operations would eventually be exposed. Even if it took years. Even if it cost him his life. The helicopter settled onto the landing pad of a nondescript government building, and Archie was escorted inside by agents who showed him federal identification, but whose names he knew he would never learn. As the doors closed behind him, Archie couldn't shake the feeling that his real investigation was just beginning, because somewhere out there, the director was already planning his next operation, and next time, there might not be anyone left alive to stop him. The crisp October air carried the scent of burning leaves through downtown Boston as FBI agent Lester Whitfield climbed the marble steps of the Pemberton Gallery. It was October 18, 1967, and 12 paintings worth $4 million had vanished overnight. The gallery owner, Velma Pemberton, met him at the entrance. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair and the kind of refined bearing that came from decades in Boston's art world. "Agent Whitfield, thank you for coming," Velma said. These paintings weren't just valuable, they were irreplaceable. The main gallery space was a soaring room with white walls where empty frames hung like accusatory eyes. Each frame showed precise cuts where the canvas had been removed. "Mrs. Pemberton, was there anything special about these particular paintings?" Velma hesitated. "About 3 weeks ago, I was approached by a man claiming to represent a private collector. He was very interested in these exact pieces." "Can you describe this man?" Tall, well-dressed, spoke with a slight accent. He said his name was Morris Blackwood. Lester examined the security footage from Morris's visits. The man had spent considerable time examining not the paintings themselves, but the frames, wall mountings, and security camera positions. He was casing the place, Lester said. The theft showed professional execution. The alarm had been bypassed, security guards drugged, and someone had obtained keys to the gallery's entrance. Mrs. Pemberton, yesterday I received a phone call, Velma continued. A woman named Edith Caldwell. She said she'd seen the paintings and knew where they were being held. Did she leave contact information? She said she'd call back today at 2 p.m. At exactly 2 p.m., the phone rang. This is Edith Caldwell, the voice said. The people who stole those paintings aren't ordinary thieves. They're part of an international smuggling operation. Lester identified himself as FBI. What information do you have? I used to work for them as a courier. The paintings are being held in a warehouse, but tomorrow night they're being shipped to Europe. Meet me tonight, 8 p.m., warehouse district near the harbor. Building 47, third floor, come alone. The line went dead. That evening, Lester approached Building 47, a hulking abandoned structure. He climbed 3 flights through darkness to find a vast empty space filled with shadows. Miss Caldwell? He called out. Agent Whitfield. Edith emerged from the shadows, younger than expected. Dark hair, sharp features partially concealed by dim lighting. The theft is connected to international smuggling that uses stolen art to move money across borders, she explained. I was a courier, but I want those paintings returned because Velma Pemberton was kind to me once. She handed him an address. That's where you'll find them. But Morris Blackwood is the most dangerous man you'll ever meet. He decides who lives and dies. Where is he now? Probably watching us right now. Edith disappeared down the stairwell, leaving Lester alone. As he prepared to follow, he heard footsteps, multiple sets moving up the stairs. Someone else was in the building. Lester drew his weapon and pressed himself against the brick wall, listening as the footsteps grew closer. 3 distinct sets of steps, moving with the careful precision of professionals who knew how to approach a target without making unnecessary noise. The moonlight, streaming through the boarded windows, created a patchwork of shadows that could conceal an army, and Lester realized that his position near the center of the warehouse floor made him completely exposed. He moved quickly toward a cluster of abandoned machinery, using the rusted equipment as cover while he tried to assess how many people were hunting him. A voice echoed through the empty space, speaking with the slight accent that Velma had described. Agent Whitfield, there's no point in hiding. We know you're here, and we know Miss Caldwell has already left the building. Morris Blackwood. The man who had cased the Pemberton Gallery was now stalking Lester through the warehouse like a predator who had cornered his prey. Agent Whitfield, I have a proposition for you. Come out where we can see you, and we can discuss this matter like civilized professionals. Lester remained silent, knowing that any response would give away his exact location. Instead, he moved carefully between the machinery, trying to work his way toward the stairwell that Edith had used to escape. Very well, Morris called out. If you prefer to do this the difficult way, we're prepared for that as well. The sound of breaking glass filled the warehouse as one of Morris's companions smashed out a boarded window, allowing more moonlight to flood the space. Lester could now see 3 figures moving systematically through the warehouse, armed with weapons and using professional search techniques. They weren't just art thieves, they were trained killers. Lester reached the stairwell and began descending as quietly as possible, but the old wooden steps creaked under his weight no matter how carefully he moved. Behind him, He could hear the search team redirecting toward the stairs. On the second floor, Lester found himself in a maze of abandoned offices and storage rooms. He moved through the darkness, looking for another way out of the building while listening to his pursuers spreading out to cover all possible escape routes. Agent Whitfield, Morris's voice carried clearly through the empty building. You should know that Miss Caldwell has been working for us all along. Everything she told you was designed to bring you here, alone and vulnerable. The words hit Lester like a physical blow. If Morris was telling the truth, then he'd walked directly into a trap, lured by a woman who'd seemed genuinely frightened but had actually been following a script. The stolen paintings were never the real target, Morris continued, his voice getting closer. You were the target, Agent Whitfield. Your investigation was getting too close to operations that certain people preferred to keep private. Lester found a broken window that looked out onto a fire escape, but as he prepared to climb through, he saw another armed figure waiting in the alley below. They had the building completely surrounded. You see, Agent Whitfield, art theft is such a civilized crime. No violence, no witnesses, just the quiet redistribution of beautiful objects to people who appreciate them properly. But federal investigations, those tend to be messy, unpredictable, dangerous to ongoing operations. Lester moved deeper into the maze of offices, looking for any defensive advantage. In what had once been an executive suite, he found a heavy desk that he could use as cover and a clear view of the doorway. The unfortunate truth is that your investigation ends here, Agent Whitfield. But I want you to know that your death will serve a greater purpose. It will send a message to other federal agents that some cases are better left unsolved. The first of Morris's men appeared in the doorway, moving cautiously with his weapon raised. Lester fired twice, dropping the intruder and alerting the others to his exact location. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Automatic weapons fire shredded the office furniture around him, forcing Lester to stay low behind the desk, while bullets ricocheted off concrete walls and shattered the remaining windows. When the shooting stopped, Morris's voice rang out again. Agent Whitfield, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and I promise your death will be quick and professional. I've got a better idea, Lester shouted back. Why don't you surrender to me, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial before you're executed. Morris laughed, a sound that echoed eerily through the empty building. Agent Whitfield, you still don't understand what you're dealing with. The art theft was just a cover story. The real operation involves moving much more valuable commodities across international borders. What kind of commodities? Information, Agent Whitfield. State secrets, military plans, intelligence reports. Stolen artwork is just a convenient way to transport documents without attracting attention from customs officials. Lester felt pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. The sophisticated techniques used to steal the paintings, the international connections, the willingness to commit murder. This wasn't just about art theft, it was about espionage. The 12 paintings from the Pemberton Gallery, Morris continued, contained microfilm hidden in the frames. Documents that certain foreign governments were very eager to acquire. What kind of documents? FBI surveillance reports on Soviet intelligence operations in Boston. Very detailed, very valuable, very dangerous to the agents whose identities were contained in those files. The revelation hit Lester like a sledgehammer. He wasn't just investigating art theft. He was pursuing foreign spies who had stolen classified federal documents. You see why you can't be allowed to leave this building alive, Morris said. Your investigation has already compromised several ongoing counterintelligence operations. Lester heard footsteps moving in the hallway outside the office, positioning for another assault. He checked his ammunition and found that he had perhaps a dozen rounds left, not nearly enough to fight his way out of the building. But as he prepared for what might be his final gunfight, Lester heard a sound that gave him hope. Sirens in the distance, growing louder. "Agent Whitfield," Morris called out. And for the first time his voice carried a note of urgency. "It appears you weren't as alone as we thought." The sirens were definitely getting closer, and Lester could hear multiple vehicles approaching the warehouse district. Either the FBI had tracked him down, or someone had called in reports of gunfire. "Time to leave," Morris said to his companions, and Lester could hear them moving toward the stairs. But before they could escape, the building was suddenly flooded with light as police vehicles surrounded the warehouse. Spotlights penetrated through the broken windows, and amplified voices began demanding that everyone inside surrender immediately. "This is the FBI," came a voice through a bullhorn. "The building is surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." Lester moved to the broken window and called out to identify himself. Within minutes, federal agents were pouring into the building, sweeping each floor systematically. But when they reached the third floor where the confrontation had begun, Morris Blackwood and his team had vanished. An FBI search team found evidence of their presence. Spent ammunition, footprints in the dust, even blood from the man Lester had wounded. But the spies themselves had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. "Agent Whitfield," said the team leader as they escorted Lester from the building, "how did you know to call for backup?" "I didn't," Lester replied. "I came here alone." "Then who called in the report of federal agents under fire?" Lester looked around at the flashing lights and organized chaos of the crime scene, trying to understand how rescue had arrived at exactly the right moment. "Someone who wanted to make sure I survived," he said finally. As they drove back to FBI headquarters for debriefing, Lester reflected on everything he'd learned during the confrontation with Morris Blackwood. The stolen paintings had been a cover for espionage operations, but that raised troubling questions about how foreign agents had gained access to classified FBI surveillance reports. The next morning, Lester met with his supervisor to discuss the case and its implications. "Agent Whitfield, based on your report, we're treating this as a matter of national security rather than a simple art theft," Assistant Director Reynolds said. "The paintings themselves are secondary to the intelligence documents that were apparently hidden in the frames." "What about Morris Blackwood and his team?" "They've disappeared completely. No trace of them at any border crossings, airports, or known safe houses. Professional intelligence operatives with excellent escape plans." "And Edith Caldwell?" "Also gone." Which raises the question of whether she was really helping you or leading you into a trap. Lester had been wondering about that himself. Edith's warning about Morris being dangerous had seemed genuine, and her information about the warehouse had led to the confrontation that exposed the espionage operation. "Sir, I think Edith Caldwell saved my life. If she hadn't insisted on meeting at the warehouse, we never would have discovered that this case involved foreign intelligence operations. Or she could have been following orders to expose you to Morris Blackwood in a location where your death could be easily arranged." Reynolds handed him a thick file folder. "Agent Whitfield, this case is being transferred to our counterintelligence division. Your role in the investigation is officially over." "What about the stolen paintings? What about Velma Pemberton's collection?" "Secondary priorities. The recovery of classified documents takes precedence over art theft." But as Lester left the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces of the puzzle he didn't understand. Why had Morris and his team allowed themselves to be trapped in the warehouse when they clearly had escape routes planned? Why had backup arrived at exactly the right moment? and what had happened to the stolen paintings. That afternoon, he drove back to the Pemberton Gallery to update Velma on the investigation status. What he found there would change his understanding of the entire case. The Pemberton Gallery looked different when Lester arrived that afternoon. The empty frames that had hung accusingly on the walls for over a week were gone, replaced by new paintings that seemed to glow in the carefully positioned lighting. Velma stood in the center of the main gallery space, directing two men in coveralls who were adjusting the position of a large landscape painting. "Mrs. Pemberton," Lester called out, confused by what he was seeing. She turned toward him with a smile that seemed forced. "Agent Whitfield, how wonderful to see you again. As you can see, I've decided to move forward with new acquisitions rather than dwelling on what was lost." Lester moved closer to examine the paintings. They were beautiful pieces, clearly valuable, but something about the situation felt wrong. "Mrs. Pemberton, where did these paintings come from? The investigation into your stolen collection is still ongoing." "Oh, that?" Velma waved her hand dismissively. "I've decided not to pursue the matter any further. My insurance will cover the loss, and I'd rather focus on the future than the past." The men in coveralls finished their work and left the gallery, but not before one of them gave Velma a look that seemed more like a report than a goodbye. "Mrs. Pemberton, we need to talk privately. There are developments in your case that you need to understand." "I'm afraid I'm rather busy this afternoon, Agent Whitfield. Perhaps we could schedule something for next week?" But Lester wasn't leaving without answers. Something fundamental had changed since his confrontation with Morris Blackwood, and Velma's sudden disinterest in recovering her stolen art was part of it. "Mrs. Pemberton, those men who were hanging paintings, who were they?" "Just contractors I hired to help with the installation. They didn't look like art handlers. They moved like security personnel." Velma's composed facade cracked slightly. "Agent Whitfield, I think you should leave. Not until you tell me what's really going on here. Yesterday, you were desperate to recover your stolen collection. Today, you're hanging new paintings and dismissing the entire investigation. Things change, Agent Whitfield. Sometimes it's better to accept a loss and move on." Lester studied the new paintings more carefully, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Hidden in the ornate frames of several pieces were small electronic devices that looked like listening equipment. "Mrs. Pemberton, your gallery is under surveillance. These paintings contain monitoring devices." "I don't know what you're talking about." But her voice carried the tremor of someone who was terrified and trying desperately to hide it. "Who's watching you, Mrs. Pemberton? Who forced you to drop the investigation?" Before she could answer, the gallery's front door opened and Morris Blackwood walked in as casually as if he were a customer browsing for art. "Agent Whitfield," he said pleasantly. "I was hoping I'd find you here." Lester's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but Morris raised his hands to show he was unarmed. "There's no need for violence. I'm here to offer you a proposition. The same kind of proposition you offered last night in the warehouse." That was a misunderstanding. Things got out of hand when they shouldn't have. Morris moved through the gallery with the confidence of someone who owned the place. "You see, Agent Whitfield, Mrs. Pemberton and I have reached an understanding about her stolen collection." "What kind of understanding?" "The paintings will be returned to her within the week, completely undamaged. In exchange, she's agreed to host certain pieces in her gallery that serve our operational needs." Lester looked at the listening devices hidden in the frames and understood what Morris was describing. The Pemberton Gallery was being turned into a surveillance post. you're using her gallery to spy on Boston's art community. Among other things, art collectors tend to be wealthy, well-connected individuals who often have access to information that foreign governments find valuable. And if Mrs. Pemberton refuses to cooperate? Morris's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. Then she'll experience the same unfortunate accidents that have befallen other uncooperative gallery owners in recent months. Velma stood frozen between them, clearly terrified but trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. "Agent Whitfield," she said quietly, "perhaps you should leave. I don't want any trouble." "Mrs. Pemberton, you don't have to do this. The FBI can provide protection." "Can you?" Morris asked. "Can you protect her 24 hours a day for the rest of her life? Can you guarantee that our associates won't find creative ways to reach her despite federal protection?" Lester realized that Morris was probably right. The espionage network he represented had demonstrated resources and capabilities that rivaled federal law enforcement. "What do you want from me?" Lester asked. "Your silence, your cooperation, your agreement to file a report stating that the stolen paintings were destroyed and that the case is unsolvable. In exchange for what? Mrs. Pemberton's continued good health, and perhaps some information that might be useful to your career." Morris reached into his coat and withdrew a manila envelope. "Intelligence reports on Soviet operations in Boston that your counterintelligence division would find very interesting. You're offering to spy for the FBI? I'm offering to share information that serves our mutual interests. The Soviet intelligence network in Boston is as much a threat to our operations as it is to yours." Lester stared at the envelope, recognizing the impossible position he'd been placed in. Accept Morris's offer, and he'd become complicit in espionage operations. Refuse, and Velma Pemberton would likely be killed. "Agent Whitfield," Velma said softly, "please. I just want this to end." "You see," Morris said, "Mrs. Pemberton understands the practical realities of the situation. Sometimes cooperation is the only path to survival." But before Lester could respond, the gallery's front windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and smoke. Federal agents poured through the opening, weapons drawn and shouting commands. In the chaos that followed, Morris disappeared as completely as if he'd never existed. One moment he was standing in the center of the gallery. The next he was gone, leaving only the manila envelope on the floor where he'd been standing. "Agent Whitfield," called the team leader as agents secured the building. "Are you injured?" "I'm fine." But Morris Blackwood was here. He just vanished. "We saw him enter the building, but thermal imaging shows only you and Mrs. Pemberton inside." Lester looked around the gallery, trying to understand how Morris had escaped from a building that was completely surrounded. The answer came when he noticed that one of the new paintings was hanging crooked, revealing a section of wall that had been cut away to create a hidden passage. "He had an escape route planned," Lester said. "Probably connects to the building next door. We're searching the entire block, but he's had several minutes head start." As the federal agents processed the crime scene, Lester spoke privately with Velma about what had happened. "Mrs. Pemberton, you're going to need federal protection. Morris Blackwood won't give up easily. Agent Whitfield, I don't think protection will be enough. These people have resources that seem to rival the government's. What did they threaten you with specifically? They said they knew where my sister lives in Florida, where my nephew goes to school in California, even where my elderly mother is staying in the nursing home. They made it clear that cooperation was the only way to keep my family safe." Lester realized that Morris's organization had been planning this operation for months, possibly years. The theft of the paintings had been just the first step in a larger plan to compromise Velma and turn her gallery into a surveillance post. Mrs. Pemberton, did Morris ever mention who he works for? What organization he represents? He said he worked for people who understood that the Cold War was being fought with information rather than weapons. He claimed that art galleries were perfect covers for intelligence operations because they attracted the kind of wealthy, connected clientele that governments wanted to monitor. The manila envelope that Morris had dropped contained exactly what he'd promised: detailed intelligence reports on Soviet operations in Boston. But as Lester read through the documents, he realized they were almost too good to be true. "Agent Whitfield," said the team leader, "we've finished searching the adjacent buildings. No sign of Morris Blackwood or his associates. Did you find where the hidden passage leads?" "To a network of tunnels that connect several buildings in this district. Very sophisticated, probably took months to construct." As the federal agents prepared to leave, Lester made a decision that would define the rest of his career. "Mrs. Pemberton, I want you to reopen your gallery and continue operating normally. Agent Whitfield, that's suicide. Morris Blackwood will come back. I'm counting on it. But next time, we'll be ready for him." The plan that Lester proposed to his supervisors was both simple and dangerous. They would allow Velma to reopen the gallery while maintaining hidden surveillance of the building. When Morris returned, and Lester was certain he would, they would be waiting. "Agent Whitfield," Assistant Director Reynolds said during the briefing, "you're asking us to use a civilian as bait for foreign intelligence operatives." "Sir, Mrs. Pemberton is already a target. This gives us a chance to protect her while exposing Morris Blackwood's entire network. And if the plan fails, then we lose an opportunity that may never come again." Reynolds approved the operation, but with strict conditions. Velma would be under constant federal protection. The gallery would be monitored around the clock, and at the first sign of serious danger, the operation would be terminated. What none of them realized was that Morris Blackwood was already 3 steps ahead of them, and that the real trap was just beginning. 3 days passed without any sign of Morris Blackwood. The Pemberton Gallery reopened with FBI surveillance teams positioned in nearby buildings, monitoring every person who entered or left. Velma went through the motions of running her business, but Lester could see the strain wearing on her with each passing hour. On the 4th day, something changed. "Agent Whitfield," crackled the voice through his earpiece, "we have a problem. The listening devices in the gallery frames have been activated remotely. Someone's monitoring conversations inside the building." Lester was positioned across the street in an unmarked van, watching the gallery through high-powered surveillance equipment. "Can you trace the signal?" "It's bouncing off multiple relay points. Whoever's receiving the transmission is using sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques." "Any sign of Morris or his team?" "Negative. But Agent Whitfield, there's something else. Mrs. Pemberton just received a phone call that's got her very agitated." Through the van's monitors, Lester could see Velma pacing frantically in her office, clearly upset about whatever she'd just heard. "I'm going in," Lester said. "Agent Whitfield, that breaks protocol. If Morris is monitoring the gallery, your presence will alert him that this is a federal operation." But Lester was already out of the van, crossing the street toward the gallery entrance. Something in Velma's body language suggested immediate danger, and he wasn't going to wait for approval from headquarters. He found Velma in her office, staring at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. "Mrs. Pemberton, what happened?" "He called," she whispered. "Morris, he said the game was over." "What game?" "Agent Whitfield, he knows about the FBI surveillance. He knows about the listening devices, the hidden cameras, everything." Lester felt cold dread settling in his stomach. What did he say exactly? He said that federal agents weren't the only ones who could set traps. He said, Velma's voice broke. He said that everyone in this building was going to die in exactly 10 minutes. We need to evacuate immediately. But as Lester reached for his radio to alert the surveillance teams, the gallery's lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting eerie shadows throughout the building. Mrs. Pemberton were leaving, right now. They moved toward the front door, but it wouldn't open. The electronic locks had been engaged remotely, trapping them inside. Agent Whitfield, came Morris's voice through the gallery's intercom system. I told you this game was over. Morris, let Mrs. Pemberton go. Your quarrel is with me. My quarrel is with federal agents who interfere in operations they don't understand. But don't worry, this will be over quickly. Lester tried his radio, but got only static. The FBI surveillance teams were being jammed, cut off from communication. You see, Agent Whitfield, the real art theft happened months ago. We've been planning this operation since long before Mrs. Pemberton's paintings were stolen. What operation? The elimination of an FBI art crime team that was getting too close to our network. You, specifically. The realization hit Lester like a sledgehammer. The entire case had been designed to lure him into a trap. The stolen paintings, Edith Caldwell's phone calls, even the confrontation at the warehouse. All of it had been orchestrated to bring him here, alone and vulnerable. Mrs. Pemberton was never the target, Morris continued. She was just bait to ensure you'd come personally instead of sending a task force. Lester looked at Velma and saw the truth in her expression. She'd known all along. You're working with them, he said. Agent Whitfield. They have my sister, my nephew, my mother. They'll kill them all if I don't cooperate. How long? Since the beginning. The paintings were never stolen. We just moved them to storage. Morris needed a crime serious enough to attract FBI attention, but not so serious that you'd send a large team. The intercom crackled again. 5 minutes, Agent Whitfield. I suggest you make peace with whatever gods you believe in. Lester examined the gallery's layout, looking for any possible escape route. The front and rear doors were electronically locked. The windows were reinforced glass that would be difficult to break, and the hidden passage Morris had used was probably sealed. But in Velma's office, he noticed something that might give them a chance. Mrs. Pemberton, the basement. Does this building have a basement? Yes, but it's just storage. Any external access, delivery doors, utility entrances. There's a coal chute that connects to the alley, but it hasn't been used in decades. They found the basement stairs and descended into darkness, broken only by the weak emergency lighting. The basement was filled with crated artwork and storage boxes, but in the far corner, Lester could see a metal chute that had once been used to deliver coal. 3 minutes, Morris announced over the intercom. The coal chute was narrow and partially blocked by debris, but it was their only chance. Lester cleared the opening while Velma gathered the courage to climb into what was essentially a metal tunnel leading into unknown darkness. Mrs. Pemberton, I need you to go first. If something happens to me, you need to reach the FBI surveillance teams and tell them what's really happening. Agent Whitfield, I'm sorry. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. Go. Now. Velma squeezed into the coal chute and began crawling toward the alley. Lester followed, struggling to fit through the narrow passage while listening for any sound that might indicate Morris had discovered their escape route. They emerged into the alley just as the Pemberton Gallery exploded behind them. The blast shattered windows throughout the block and set off car alarms for 6 blocks in every direction. Lester threw himself over Velma. shielding her from debris that rained down from the destroyed building. When the smoke cleared, the gallery was gone. Nothing remained but a pile of rubble and flames. Agent Whitfield. FBI agents were running toward them from their surveillance positions, shouting into radios and calling for emergency services. Morris Blackwood, Lester gasped as they helped him to his feet. He's still out there. Agent Whitfield, thermal imaging shows no survivors in the building. If Blackwood was inside, he's dead. But Lester wasn't convinced. Morris had demonstrated an ability to disappear at will, to plan operations months in advance, to stay one step ahead of federal investigations. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said as paramedics examined her for injuries, "you need to tell them everything. The entire truth about your cooperation with Morris's organization." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Agent Whitfield, the paintings. My real collection. It's still in storage. Morris said he'd return them when the operation was complete." "What operation?" "Killing me." Proving that the FBI's art crime team could be eliminated whenever his organization chose to do so. As fire trucks arrived and began fighting the blaze that had once been the Pemberton Gallery, Lester realized that Morris had succeeded in his primary objective. The explosion would be investigated as a terrorist attack. The truth about the espionage operation would be classified, and the Morris Blackwood would disappear back into whatever shadow organization had created him. 3 months later, Lester received a package at his home address. Inside was a single photograph showing all 12 of Velma's stolen paintings hanging in what appeared to be a private gallery somewhere in Europe. On the back of the photograph, in Morris's distinctive handwriting, was a simple message. "The game continues, Agent Whitfield. Next time, the stakes will be higher." Lester never saw Morris Blackwood again, but he never stopped looking over his shoulder, never stopped wondering when the next move in their deadly game would come. Because in the world of international espionage, some games never truly end. They just pause between moves,